Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Boys Table Podcast. I'm Pronago, and with me is IskatuMesk.
Hitler.
That's him. Today we're going to be talking about games as art, and more specifically, what games need to do to be considered art in the objective sense. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to read off the definition of art according to Merriam-Webster, and we'll unpack it and see if we agree with it. So we got skill acquired by experience, study, or observation. That's one of them. There's 6 different definitions, but that seems pretty reductive.
I think that's like a working term for
Yeah,
like an art. Like I'm a mason. That's my art.
yeah. It's like a trade. So then we have the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects, the art of painting landscapes. Also, works so produced, a gallery for modern art.
Again, more of a...
Yeah, so I'm not really seeing much of an actual...
I think that the traditional definition of art, as then you look at a piece of work and you say, wow, this is a work of art, is art is a purpose that has been placed into expression. So one of the examples I was given with before is early black metal. People would be really angry about something or have like something they kind of want to say, and they turn it into like this very like angry piece of music with, you know, the instrumentation that tends to not really have that much post-processing going on, and then, you know, the vocals, the growling vocals and the yelling and stuff like that, and the actual lyrics behind it, all towards that end with varying results.
Right, and the idea that art is, or rather that purpose is intrinsic to art is, I think, where a lot of the arguments for games as art tend to fall apart, because, you know, I think you described it as there's a different, like, art is purpose-seeking expression in one of your videos, and the inverse is true of most games, where it's expression-seeking purpose. And that's generally not the formula you want to follow. Like, I think you can accidentally luck into a situation where maybe you got some stuff right with that sort of formula. But when you're just expressing stuff, and you just have this thing happening, or this event in your story, or this element of your game, you know, it has to have a purpose intrinsic to it for it to build into something larger that can't be called a work of art, I think. And typically you don't see that in a lot of games. You have games that typically just have mechanics that, especially in the modern day, especially in the West, don't really try to constitute a challenge. They don't really open the door for skill expression. It's a lot of... I mean, it's not even the core mechanics that are necessarily always at fault, but that's usually the building block, and then you have the execution of single-player or multiplayer experience where, you know, you're looking at something that's generally being handheld to you in the learning process. Now, here's a bit of a spin-off question is, do you consider the premise of games as art to even be true? Like, what has there been an artistic game?
The thing about art, and even things you don't even consider as art, just like a product in general, is it's a completed item. So every element that goes into something should be at least a comparable quality to the rest of it, but all of an exceedingly high quality. Well, that rolls out pretty much every single game ever made already. Because I think that while a lot of games have some members of their development team who really did have passion in it and really did put in effort, and if that effort had been spread across the product, it would have turned out to be an exceptional piece of software, even StarCraft. And, you know, that unfortunately never actually translates to the rest of the development. So there's plenty of games that are really, really bad, that have really interesting ideas placed within them, but that doesn't make them art at all. I think that there are some games that they get to the stage that, you know, you see a completed product and it's really good, and you think that that's the closest you can get to being art. One example would be R-Type 3. You know, that's like one of the closest examples to art that you can get. And there's a couple of other titles as well. And like, for example, Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night and stuff like that. Games that just basically exude an attention to detail. And these games still ultimately will have some flaws in them, but they tend to be really minor, as opposed to most modern titles, which are really major. But as a medium, games are a technical construct, and they're made for the purpose of making money. So already, right off the bat, this is, if your intent is to make art, you're already being dishonest, and your product is already going to fail. There are many quote-unquote indie games, who are not indie because they use a central publisher being Steam, that try to be artsy by making something that is not actually a game. Last of Us is a very great example of this. It's not actually a game. It's basically a walking simulator with some quick time events and just really static shit thrown on top of it. And it's really, really annoying to actually play. But people think it's artsy because it has voice acting in it, because it's kind of like an interactive movie to an extent. But it fails at being a game, so it has to actually be a game in order to be considered artistic as a game. It fails at being a movie because it introduces interactive elements that are not developed at all. And the whole thing just like immediately falls apart. Like if you wanted to make a movie, I think it could have been an interesting movie, even though the whole zombie thing is done to death and the plot was incredibly uninspired. But they had like decent voice actors and stuff in it, so maybe they could have gotten somewhere with the movie. But they just had to make a game because they want to make art as a game because they failed in other industries, and the game industry has no standards. So you can just kind of throw yourself into it and just succeed because you said you're art, so liberals will believe you.
So the main tenet here is that games can't be art. Well, one of the things that you mentioned. Okay, go ahead.
There's a thing I want to add. Games can be used for artistic expression. The main example I would like to bring up is StarCraft professional play. So when you see a very high-level player, such as Flash or Jaedong, play StarCraft, you cannot help be moved by several things. First of all, their passion for the game. Not just the fact that they're very good and they have an extremely intense training regimen and they've put a lot of time and energy into it, but how well they adapt to things on the fly. The game in itself is not art when they're using it, but it's being used in much the same sense as a paintbrush is being used for art. And their expression with the game becomes art because the game allows them to express themselves without really much in the way of limitations.
Right, so in this instance, the game itself is not art, but offers a pathway to, make art.
It offers a pathway to an expression for a purpose, basically.
Right, exactly. So one of the things that I think a lot of people will get caught up in is one of the things that you mentioned. One of the core tenets, I would argue, is that when you make something for money, you're being dishonest if your goal was to make art and you're doing it for money at the same time, there is dishonesty intrinsic in that sort of position.
This brings us right to the loudness war thing. What makes money? Attention. If you are going to make sacrifices, you're going to make decisions because your ultimate goal is to make money. And if you're smart about making money, you're going to do things that pull you more towards the aspect of making money rather than finding an expression for a purpose, which means that you're going to be greedy. So all the music just copy pastes off of people who are successful and then ramps up the volume and compression to grab more attention. Attention is good. Doesn't matter if that attention is objectively a positive element or not. As long as you get attention, as you get money, your end result is successful. That's also why I say when you're looking for stuff like game reviews and stuff, stay away from platforms where people have the means to get money. They may be a good person, they may have very honest intents, but it creates a psychological effect when you are monetarily involved in something and your success in terms of living conditions and everything else depends upon being monetarily successful. You will be subconsciously making decisions on behalf of that rather than anything else. And especially in the Western industry, where games are viewed as toys rather than as like mediums, you will run into that much more often than not. Take, for example, the arcades. So if you're familiar with the arcades, a lot of Japanese arcade titles are very, very difficult. And one of the things that scales with the difficulty is the scoring system and such. And basically, in a lot of these, the better you do, the more the scoring rank goes up and the more difficult things get. For example, more enemies, faster projectiles, stuff like that. So when you first start the game, you'll probably be relatively successful and not really spending many coins. This depends on the title, evidently, but in the West, most of the firms will be like, hey, let's just set the scoring system to maximum so we can get as much money out of people and make them burn as many coins as possible to get anywhere in the game. They take something that was otherwise fairly innocently designed, but still ultimately designed with the intent of, making the product more difficult over time, so that people who really wanted to invest into it did have to spend coins. They turn it into a completely binarily greedy object and destroyed the whole experience, regardless of the quality of the original title. Just the entire mindset behind the people presenting that stuff destroyed it.
So when you're looking at an instance, this is like an example of where you have a mechanic by which the game itself is monetized, and there's a way to do it that the Japanese did it, where it's not as aggressively monetized, but it still offers a source of revenue, I suppose. And then you compare that to the West's version of that, which is more ramped up in the favor of monetization. I suppose you'd probably see that more. I'm not actually completely unfamiliar with the Japanese game market now, but I assume there's a lot less microtransactions. Is that, I don't know if you're...
That changed a lot. Basically, Japan's a pretty small country. They've got lots of population, but they're pretty small. And people in Japan realized, oh wait, there's other markets out there we can, pull from. And I'm not really like super well versed in this, but I think that Japanese are they're really much more into mobile in general, like cell phone games and stuff like that took off really big in there. And you had a lot of, obviously, like the Switch is probably a really big indicator of how the Japanese market is like. It's kind of
I
like
completely forgot that Nintendo
the design child of kind of the trend that market has been taking. But also, you may have noticed developers more or less pushing towards mobile for quite some time. There's a lot of Japanese-only titles in there, but
I do remember Nintendo taking a stance that was more along the lines of, looking to break into the mobile market and stay there, as opposed to continuing to make consoles.
And people laughed at them, but ultimately it's actually turned out to be quite successful. It's a very congested market, especially now, but you may be familiar with the term MOBAGE. M-O-B-A-G-E, or G-E. That's not MOBA, that's MOBAGE. I'm not entirely sure what it stands for, but a Japanese person was describing it to me as basically that's the term for phone games. And there's also gacha, which is the loot boxes. So this is where the whales come in. These are the phone games where you spend up to $1,000+ on RNG loot boxes to try to get a JPEG of your waifu. And I know people who have done this. And I'm not entirely sure why that is so successful in Japan, but it obviously poured over into the Western market. There's a lot of Western people who try to get past the systems that, for example, Korea, a lot of Korean games require you to have a Korean ID to make an account for. Like the system, I'm not entirely sure why, but it's entirely specifically to keep foreigners out. So people will either buy Korean IDs or get their Korean friends to give them their IDs, and they'll register an account and they'll actually be paying them. And as well, for Japanese people, will have online guides or whatever to make accounts for the Japanese websites, and then these people end up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a game that isn't even in English. And I'm still not entirely sure what drives people to do that, other than the gambling addiction thing, which kind of goes off topic. But Japan wasn't always like that. Like, Japan was very, very anti-Western for a long time. And Sega and stuff like that is what eventually drove them into the gutter. Basically, you had the Super Nintendo. And the Super Nintendo actually had a restriction on, I think, how many games a publisher could publish on it in a year. And that made a lot of, especially American developers, very angry because they couldn't just shit out garbage on the SNES. So although the SNES, the library has stuff on it that's not very good, the vast majority of it, even like the mediocre stuff, is still like reasonably okay by today's standards. But if you look at the Genesis, it's filled with like the most worst of the ports, awful like third-party shit that just got puked onto it. Like, it's the entire library is just filled to the brim with trash. I can go onto a list and pull out like dozens of garbage titles for you. But after the Super Nintendo, though, then you got into the whole 3D thing, and this is where Japan was like, shit, there's an American market that really doesn't care about the quality of the games. And there was the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1. Sure, great titles were made for both of them, but 3D as a concept didn't have any place in games. And even today, most 3D games still look like complete trash. The technology is there, nobody's using it because there's no drive to use it. But back then, especially, like the PlayStation didn't even support a Z buffer. There are so many graphical glitches in basically every single game that's on that console. And you had Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VI. And then you're aware of Mystic Quest, aren't you?
Is that the one that you were posting screenshots of?
If you wanted to look at how Japan, like even today by some standards, like you've got Final Fantasy 13. And there was a statement made by Square, I believe, where they are aware of Americans not liking the title or something, and they didn't care. Like, they don't respect the Western market at all. They just see them as basically just, bottomless
a means to an end.
Yeah, but they still have to market to them, and that's still where most of their money is. But back in earlier days, it was even more bizarre. Like Japan, you had the PC Engine, which I think used CDs, and there was something I unfortunately can't bring it up off the top of my head, but there was a reason, like the N64 stuck to cartridges, and that really held it back. And there was also Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which in Japan is known as Final Fantasy USA. And if you are at all familiar with Final Fantasy, especially in that stage, there is a massive difference between Final Fantasy USA and the rest of the titles they have made, especially Final Fantasy VI, which America knows as Final Fantasy III. So a bunch of
confusing labyrinth.
It's a little confusing to get into, but remember how I talked about Angry Kirby last time? Like there's very big cultural differences, and at the time, a lot of Japanese didn't even want to deal with the American market whatsoever because they just didn't view them as worth it until money speaks louder than quality in this case. And Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a really, really bad game. It's got nothing to do with Final Fantasy in general. It's basically a bunch of cliches and tropes and a bunch of grinding. Precisely what Americans want in their games. Basically no actual substance. And that's precisely how Japan viewed it at the time, so they created Final Fantasy USA. And obviously something changed between then and afterwards, because now there is no differences between Japanese and Western titles except for the censorship. But that comes from the American half, the liberal half, because Japan still doesn't really do a lot of research in the American audience. And every now and then, some very, very vocal liberal will cry that a character shows too much leg. And then publishers will quickly censor it because they don't want bad press or something like that. Nier. Not just the new Nier, but also the older ones. That happened, as well as... I can't remember the names, but there is a site, I think it was Niche Gamer, that covers a whole bunch of censorship articles if you're interested in reading into them. It's really strange, too, because a lot of the Japanese also don't view Sega as being a legitimate company either, because Sega was host to so much garbage. And they had decent titles when they first started off, like the Sonic games for the Genesis, but even Game Center GX, I believe it is, the host is like, oh, we're playing a Sega game today. I guess we must have run out of titles to play. Like, it is like really, really obvious that, they just don't view Sega and the Genesis as being, that good. And the culture differences are really interesting because I believe we discussed the internet in Korea as well. The internet is completely different.
Oh, it's certainly more... Well, that was mostly due to the fact that the government actually viewed it as a necessary public service or something like that. Like it's provided by the government, and the infrastructure was given to them. The ability to create that infrastructure was given to them by the fact that they had recently had that big issue with North Korea. So like they were still getting through the Korean War when the internet started to become more popularized amongst several different countries, as I understand it. I'm probably mixing up the history in some capacity, but the end result was that Koreans have access to way superior internet for way better prices for the end user.
But they pay hourly too, or something like that too. So is really interesting because when you look at the things like the grinding and the paying for monthly for MMOs and stuff like that, in Korea it's entirely a new level because a lot of the MMOs and stuff have incentives to have you logged in for longer, which
Mhm.
results in you paying more for internet as well. Like it's an agreement between the developers and stuff. But when you look at a lot of Korean games, the production values in them are tremendously higher than their Western counterparts. Compare Lineage 2 to World of Warcraft. There is no comparison. Lineage 2's engine is some incredibly ancient version of Unreal 2. It's like Unreal Warfare or even older. And the unit assets in that game and the animations and the sounds and stuff like that, Blizzard can't even approach a shadow of those today in 2018. They're still copy pasting stuff from the alpha of World of Warcraft. They still are struggling to get their game to perform even reasonably well on top of the line hardware. It's an absolute disaster left and right, but there's no pressure for them to do so, so they're never going to improve that. And like I always find it really interesting about Korea because one of the things, obviously, I watched a lot of professional Brood War play, and that's when people started thinking about our game's art and stuff like that. And I was like, hell no. Even though I was, primarily focused on Brood War at the time, and Brood War obviously is the most, I believe, the most successful esport there was, at least in terms of the sheer like physical scale of it. Maybe not streamer counts or anything like that people measure things by today, but in terms of like the tournaments had like I think up to 60 or 80,000 viewers in their stadiums at some points. Like they were massive. And behind all this, you had a group of a couple dozen players who literally play this game like 8 to 10 hours a day. They live in these specialized buildings. They have coaches, they have staff, they have photographers. They're basically treated like superstars. They have everything catered to them. But at the same time, the pressure for them is absolutely immense as well. And then they get onto the stage, and something that I saw in comments is people say the Koreans are so unexpressive. They don't really. They put the camera on them when they're in the game, when they win or lose, and they're always so unexpressive. But it's because they're being polite and stuff like that. But you can once you get used to actually watching them, you see a lot of that expression, and you see a lot of that expression actually translate into how they play in the game as well. Probably one of the most infamous ones I can think of is when Jaedong played against Killer, who you might be familiar with.
Mhm.
And Killer was a C or B rank professional player. So in terms of like him versus Jaedong, it was basically like the underdog of the underdog trying to take down the king of the gods. Like he basically had no chance at all. But in terms of like actual skill level, there was basically no Western player who would even give Killer even like a sweat. There was no chance. But when you saw them playing, it was like hilarious because I think it was Jaedong anyways. Jaedong just like he had this expression on his face of like utter boredom. And the way in which he was playing was so very trolly. And he was really like obviously like making fun of his opponent. And it was a really interesting interaction because so many people in the West who view these, they obviously can't like understand most of the commentary or whatever. And they're like, oh, nobody ever doesn't. There's never any expressiveness. The players are just basically dolls, et cetera, et cetera. But you actually see a lot of this, and the way in which they play, they're like at the top of the top level. Nothing in the game gets by them. They understand so much, but there's still a lot of dynamic going on, and that's why I think that, when you have a title like Brood War that allows such expressiveness to play, and you get into the situation where you have players like this at this skill level that can really take advantage of that, that's when you start seeing the values of art take life. You start seeing people who obviously have a purpose, obviously to be successful, to be the best, to be recognized, even at something that's really intrinsically greedy in itself, because you do make money, you do get a salary for playing this. English is terrible, and I'm Canadian. It's still like a level of expression that you see in this that you really aren't going to see anywhere else in gaming except for very, very specific stuff. Because there's the mechanical skill level, which in itself can be expressionless, but the decision making behind it is expression in many ways. You're not going to see it in every StarCraft game. You're not going to see it in every professional StarCraft game, but you can and have seen it in many places. And I think that's when you start talking about, is this an art? that's at the stage you can start asking these questions and start like really drawing the line, because a lot of software is just not made with passion. And you can see that at the lowest level, at the casual consumer level. So how could it ever be something that could ever be considered art? You have to go back to a culture and an industry where, yes, we're doing this for a business, but our developers are super, 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 super passionate about it. And a lot of people will say they're super passionate about it, but they say that because they're marketers. And marketers like things to be passionate. They like people to think they're passionate about it, because then they get involved. But especially in like Japan and Korea, I think that you'll see that. And I see a guy throwing an untextured checkered box.
You trying to focus on talking about games as art while playing World of Warcraft?
Yep.
Well, that's a recipe for disaster if I've ever heard one.
I'm watching a guy throw a checkered box. That's art. Like, this is art, man. This right here, you gotta put this in the fucking Guinness Book of World Records.
You know, it's funny that you mention bad games as art, because that was actually one of the things that a good friend of mine, who's actually on the podcast, Patrick Dicksuck, whatever you know him as, Dangalang.
Dicksuck.
He played, or he watched me play Deadly Premonition, and that game. The reason why he believes that game is art is because it makes you feel things you didn't even know you could feel. And I agree with him insofar as that game was definitely a very wild ride. But it was... that's a game that was like...
You should play Evil Within. That's also a really...
I think anything by this Sweary guy is probably just a real trip. He's definitely an Eastern developer, so you don't get a lot of the normal things that you expect. You get these really strange pacing decisions that he makes, where he actually, like, the developer's cut, or director's cut rather, had more gameplay than the original. The original had less gameplay because he wanted it more to be like a movie or something. So it actually ended up being like what you were talking about with Last of Us, except you're an FBI agent and you're like running around this town and you're eating a cereal, jelly, and turkey sandwich or something. I don't even know. There's some really insane shit in that game. And oh man, I wish I could have played as the dog. Oh wait, no, you do. Never mind, you do play as the dog. So anyways, the ultimate point about that we've arrived at basically from this point onward is the idea that games can be a form of expression for art, but not art themselves. Is that what you would agree? Is like
in general?
In general.
Yeah. The other thing is that generally, as a product and as an art piece, things are supposed to improve over time and learn from the past. Games don't. So.
So you're talking about it as like a field, whereas like the people who make music in a certain genre, 10 years after that genre began, the people who are making music there will have learned from their forebears or something like that.
They should have.
Right.
That's the whole idea. They should have, but
and instead in games you see a lot of regression or side grading as opposed to actual.
Just look at StarCraft 2 from StarCraft 1. It's like I can't really give, or Diablo 3 from Diablo 2. Like there's some great examples there.
So I guess that would be... See, that's a bit of a puzzler. I mean, I don't watch as many movies as I don't watch movies as much as I play games, and I have less experience with the textual mediums, excuse me. But I have a feeling that people have learned generally. There's so many people out there writing books that it's hard to know for sure, that you can't really say this in a sweeping statement, but I do feel like, generally speaking, the books that I'm reading now are more well written than the books that I was reading when I was younger. But written media has been out for so long that it's really hard to know that you're tracking improvement in that medium compared to the how recent something like a movie has been. Movies have only existed for probably less than a century. So you're looking at something like, you compare The Godfather to Transformers. You're still seeing some regression there.
Transformers, man, that.
So at that point, it's interesting because the reason why I brought up the art definition at the beginning, right, and why I wanted to make sure that we were all using the same lexicon is because a while ago, I was using a very different definition of art than I am using now. I was using a definition that basically was able to classify anything and everything creative as art and just sort them through different categories, where it is more like you're just classifying works. I was looking at every StarCraft 2 fan campaign, every fan fiction on fanfiction.net. Yeah, sure, it's all art. It's just like you got to make good art. And that was my sort of mindset. And at that point, you're not really describing what I now view as art. It's the definition is more privy to, again, the idea of just a creation, a work. But there are more ways, I guess, for games to have pitfalls as far as not becoming art than just the for-profit aspect of them, right? Because there's plenty of indie titles or games that didn't have a profit in mind, that were donationware or simply didn't have even a donation option, was just this indie title that was released and distributed
Dwarf
online.
Fortress is probably the best example I can think of in that regard.
Right, yeah. Dwarf Fortress is definitely something that comes to mind when you look at all of those, but it's still hard to look at that as art by itself. It's more. No. It's definitely more of a.
It's definitely
sandbox.
An element of passion.
And I mean that's what I'm saying is you can look at that and think like, okay, well, look at all of these concessions that this developer had to make. Right, the developer didn't use like an Unreal Engine clone or something. Didn't use an actual proprietary engine. Didn't use a distributor like Steam. And his game spread through word of mouth and whatever promotional materials he could scrap together. It was it was a game that when you look at it, you don't look at it and get blown away by its graphics, we'll say. No. So it's definitely...
It's a very personal project, but I think that's necessary for it to be, considered passionate.
Right. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Cuphead. I'm personally not
Only
familiar.
Distantly.
Yeah, I'm personally not familiar with it at all. But this is a title that I was told was in a similar vein. Not obviously uses Steam, uses some proprietary engine, but so it's not indie in the same title. But the developers of that game left publishing and developing studios. They left whatever studios they were part of. They reportedly mortgaged their houses and did all of this other stuff to be able to fund the creation of their own game. And it was well received, maybe because of that. Maybe they used that in some way as marketing, but definitely received in a sense where everybody said that there was an element of passion in that game that couldn't be felt in other games, that was missing in other titles, that were just sort of cranked out by these factories that are the big publishers and developers that exist in the modern industry. So that's I guess that might be, and unfortunately neither of us are well versed in it, so that may be something of an example of a passion product, but in a more familiar territory to most people.
I can say
Dwarf
that
Fortress is
when I was
more
watching the
arcane.
videos for it, there's a lot of these new games that use the buzzword retro and try to call back to old titles, and all their graphics look like utter shit. Cuphead is probably one of the only games I've looked at in the past 10 years that is 2D and doesn't look like shit. It does not look like balls. So it's got that going for it at the very least. The first impression I had just by watching it was positive. It also made a lot of game journalists, quote unquote, butthurt, and that's only good things too. So
well, when you screw with the established sort of hierarchy, I guess, of the media and the games journalism, the development studios, whatever, if you're bucking some sort of industry trend and people are taking notice, it hopefully, I just hope it's for a good reason in that case. And
I mean, it was literally just do an air dash, and the game journalists don't actually play games. They're just handed a script. So when it came to doing something like just performing an air dash, he couldn't even do it. I was showed a video for that, and it was like, are people actually surprised by this? It's actually confounded that people actually be surprised that this is what these people get paid, friggin' 5 or 6 figures to just be in marketing outsource they like are people actually surprised? But they were surprised that these guys don't know how to play a simple 2D platformer with some of the most generic control elements in existence at this stage for such titles. So it was nice to see casuals get slapped up and start to realize that they are just getting had. But obviously, you know, Kotaku and everyone still is in business, so we're not out of the woods yet.
Well, I think there's a growing sensation amongst the people that, not only in my circles, but in the people that I just watch, the general users of social media that happen to be commenting on things in the games, games world, games journalism, whatever you want to call it. And I'm very much in tune with things like eSports because I watch a lot of different competitive games, like ASL stuff for Brood War, basically any tournament that's going on for Counter-Strike, stuff like that. I used to be more invested in League, but now the game is so far from what little I enjoyed from it to begin with that it doesn't really feel too rewarding for me to watch it in the first place.
One of the things that really bothered me about League was how volatile the teams were. You never could get a sense for anybody. You could never really root for any one team because every single season they were completely different. It was basically just a bunch of Koreans feeding off of the Americans with bigger purses than their home, or Chinese or whoever. And the Americans would be like, oh, you're Asian, so you're a good player. I'll pay you this massive amount of money. There was always just this massive upheaval every single time there was a break between play. Then, of course, the game got more and more and more casual as time goes on. And it just was hard to really have a sense of grounding in what you were watching at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, some of the teams in Counter-Strike are probably similar in that respect, but generally speaking, I feel like there's more of a set period of time where you expect rosters to be swapped, and generally they're only swapping one or two players, not an entire team upheaval. That's very rare, actually. So that helps me to, I guess, align myself better with the active players. But I typically don't find myself rooting for a particular team in esports in general. I've never really got into that with professional athletic sports. I was always just sort of people say that you're supposed to root for the team that's nearest to you, based in the town nearest to you, and I never really found much of an attachment to that idea. So from basically a young age, I guess I was mostly only drawn to games that I enjoyed watching, and none of those were the athletic sports. It was like, oh, people play this game that I play, StarCraft. Well, I'm gonna go watch them play that, and I didn't know any of the personalities in the game is what hooked me in the first place. And then enjoying their play, Bisu, Micro Marines, or whatever the case may be. That's where you get to start to enjoy the scene a little bit more, and that's where I didn't find out how much I enjoyed esports until way later, but you get people like I Love Uv who basically revolutionized how you play a certain race, or I guess like Jelizerg. There's all these different names that I just remember from way back, and it's interesting how much of this conversation so far has actually been surrounding Brood War, because that was definitely the most influential title of my life. Not only the title that I still make content for, but a title that I've played an insane amount, and I've watched an equally insane amount in terms of when it comes to number of hours spent or whatever.
Brood War is what got me in the computers, really. I mean, I used the old iMacs, and I used the 486 and stuff like this, but Brood War is what got me into computers, and until then, I had played predominantly the N64 or the PlayStation 1. I talk about the Genesis and stuff like that. That's all stuff I grew up with. That's all stuff I lived with.
Right.
But when Brood War first came out is when I was introduced to, or StarCraft 1, not just Brood War. And it wasn't long after that I got my first computer. And I immediately got into making maps, and I immediately got into making custom AI for it, and that's what got me into modding. And that's actually what defined my life from there on, because until then I was basically aimless. The most amount I had done, I wrote novels and I made comics and stuff like that, but I've never been much of a physical arts person, ever. And I was never any good at drawing, or I could never write. I used computers for that, but it was in school. basically, instead of doing schoolwork, I wrote novels. I just ignored all forms of, public education and just said, hey, let me use your computer and I'll write stuff and you do whatever, because the classes were so easy to pass, I didn't even need to actually pay attention to what was going on in the course at all until I eventually dropped out, which I dropped out because I wanted to pursue modding and writing. And because school was awful and toxic. But, yeah, Brood War all the way from 1998 to 2009 was my focus for much of that time.
It's really weird because I look at Brood War as still, even after all these years, as like a fountain of potential, not just for people who are playing it to express some purpose that they have, but the idea, like, you got into AI modding from a very early age in Brood War's lifespan, and only recently have I really cut my teeth in that department. And there's especially with all of these new things that I've gotten added to the engine, there's so many possibilities for you to design AI that genuinely behaves in a reasonable but unpredictable manner, in a manner that is consistent with what a player would do if they had the same sort of resources at their disposal. And that to me is like, there is excuse me, there is some purpose to be expressed there. There's something to be discovered and molded into a purpose, perhaps. And it's funny how I caught me off guard that we ended up talking about this much about Brood War in the first place, because if there's one game, right, but
that's how you learn about this stuff. So, it's not really too surprising to me that that's eventually where you end up, because this is where the bulk of your time with the subject matter comes in. Like, a lot of people, like, for example, games journalists, quote unquote, will talk about these subjects and they've never actually been exposed to them whatsoever. They've never dealt with actual game development, and they've never dealt with modding. They don't even know the process that the corporations go through to market their stuff. And this is all basically mandatory to even start talking about the subject whatsoever.
It certainly is. Well, here's the issue. You have the games journalists, and if people think that games are art, then people will take journalists of an artistic field more seriously, and they will be treated with more respect, and more respect generally means
they're seen as an authority. It's this giant,
so there's a power
kind of
influence there. Yeah, there's like okay, well, I can become more powerful by being considered an authority figure. I can also through that power, through that social currency, gain actual financial currency or value, or move up the corporate ladder, or whatever the case may be. So there's an incentive for them to market themselves and their game, their medium, as an authority of art and art respectively. So it's really hard to have an honest conversation with people who are so intrinsically defined and reliant on their medium. But it's also really, I guess it's not bizarre, because it's what what you would expect out of people who know that they don't have to do too much work to get paid. But it really does it caught me off guard when I first was looking over all of the details of these journalists who don't actually play the games that they claim to be playing, that just write like social justice or political advocacy content. Like they basically write political journals as if that was a game review. There's like a bunch of recent examples, which would be like that Kingdom Come game. I think recently there was some controversy about guns in video games, just because everybody's been freaking out about the mass shootings that have been happening.
Yes, it's not a problem with our mental health care, rather lack thereof, or the insane hostility and stress and work overload people have to deal with in the capitalism-driven, for-profit, quote-unquote, education system. Oh no, it's those darn games and that rock and roll!
Yeah, might as well be taking a look at the... I don't know. It's pretty funny how they started off with Dungeons and Dragons in like the 80s or something, and then they were like,
oh, Harry Potter was a good one. I remember my grandmother telling me, Harry Potter teaches you to summon the devil. Don't you be watching them Harry Potter movies. Literally word for word what she told me.
That's pretty good. And,
Incidentally, Harry Potter, I turned him into a sexual Tyrannosaurus.
See, she was right all along. It's
She
just
was
that
right. I really did summon the devil.
the devil is a sexual dinosaur.
BDSM devil.
So you have it really does shock me though, because not only can you not have an honest conversation with these journalists about whether or not their medium even classifies as an art, but even if they were willing to sit down and have an honest conversation with you, they wouldn't be able to hold that conversation in terms of objective fact or even informed opinion, because they are not informed, because they don't seem to actually play the game.
Well, look at the whole Gamergate thing. Now whenever people think of Gamergate, they think of sexual harassment because of the actions of one or two people, when the entire focus was to expose corruption in gaming journalism. People have all but forgotten about that because of all the freaking cover-up and shit that's going on.
Well, it's also really weird too, because you look at most people look at Gamergate as like if you're a pro Gamergate guy, then you must be into the like the objectification of women and sexism and all this other stuff, and that seems to be the default assumption.
It's a lot like the old adage about how in America, if someone wants something passed, they just start screaming, "Think of the children." That's basically what the term misogyny has become. It's this blanket term that draws attention away from other things because people are so concerned about being politically correct. If you start talking about, you're objectifying women, then you have to agree with whatever they're saying, because otherwise you're seen as a sexist, which is a bad thing in the West, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good one. The fact that you go from looking at, just think of the logical, like, train of thought that you have to go through, or the chain of command you would have to go through. You want to talk about games as art with somebody who's informed in the scene. Well, where do you go? All right, well, compare it to any other medium. You look at movies. Typically movie critics, film critics will have something to say about the qualitative standards of their medium, and they'll be. I actually, this is where I don't have a whole lot of information. I'm unfortunately ignorant about the topics at that particular topic, but the idea that you have, seeking out some critic or journalist or something in that scene, that doesn't seem like a completely false or incorrect assumption to make when you're first trying to have a conversation about this kind of stuff.
Well, I think generally speaking, if you're trying to talk to somebody, you gotta contact their secretary or whoever is managing their business email, and then they'll, if it's something they want to take part of, then they'll do a direct connection. But
when you look at how you would, how do you go from, yeah, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna contact this journalist, message him on Twitter or whatever, and then you go from that to, oh, this person actually doesn't play games. This person doesn't even know how to. What was it? They didn't know how to air jump or air dash in a platformer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't they all say that they played Mario? What happened to that? That's like the classic.
See, the reason why they say they play Mario specifically is they're trying to get those nostalgia points. Blizzard's very into that.
Well, constant references.
That's why you got Blizzard with their overweight. Got to make all these references. Got to reference all these things. That's why World of Warcraft is just incessant pop culture references. They always try to distract you from what they're doing.
Well, they also reference themselves too, which somehow seems even scummier to me.
Yes, it is.
How do you? I don't know. It's like all those Diablo Easter eggs in StarCraft 2, Heart of the Swarm. They're not even Easter eggs. They're plainly visible. There's a Murloc.
No, they got to make sure the casuals can see them, because the entire purpose is to make them a distraction.
Yeah. I remember scouring through Halo 3 looking for all the Easter eggs. And there's some skill jumps you had to make in some really strange corridors that you never would have thought you could even jump through. And you would have to do that in precisely the right way. You had to crouch jump after rocket jumping in co-op only, because if you did it you would die. It was really weird the way that you had to do it. And if you managed to do it, you could find this billboard of one of the employees' heads being photoshopped onto some bikini model or something, and then he was just it was in this dark room. And
then you've got Blizzard, who autofilates themselves so fucking much. You've got their fucking faces encoded into half of the fucking image files in Diablo 2.
Yeah. Well, who was it? Was Samwise, I think, who is the
His face is in the
is,
block in Warcraft 3. Yeah.
yeah, that's a good one. See, I guess that's a weird one too, because we were just talking about how art is purpose-seeking expression, and you look at games, and there's a lot of expression-seeking purpose. It's not a whole lot of purpose intrinsic to it. It's not a whole lot of passion intrinsic to what ends up happening. But I have to wonder, there's got to be some element of personality when you have these Easter eggs and these ideas of humor and these things that most players won't ever find or whatever. There's got to be some element of like people actually wanting to put something. I struggle to say meaningful in the concept of putting an employee's face in your game as an Easter egg, but to do something with the space that you're given.
The problem is when it comes at the cost of development time, which it clearly did for Diablo 2.
Well,
because you had like an entire Act 4 that they basically did nothing with, and they ran out of time on, which is why they had like creeping feature, and the entire end game structure was actually going to be different. We're pretty sure that Iswell was actually going to be one of the final, if not the final boss, because his stats, his stats are higher than Diablo's. Just like a whole bunch of unused stuff in the game that allude to that. But Act 4 obviously is like very, very incomplete. And instead, they have all this other shit they put time into instead of finishing their game, because that's the kind of people that Blizzard is. And this is a similar observation that can be made in comparisons to the stuff in Dark Souls versus the stuff in Symphony of the Night. Both those games have some really obscure stuff in them, but Dark Souls is another disaster of a title. And I start asking questions. So at what point are things obscure for the sake of the developer putting in, some hidden items? And what point are they obscure for the sake of just bad design?
It's just bizarre that when you have a game like Diablo 2 or like Warcraft 3 is a good example where there are so many Easter eggs. Like the number of Easter eggs per map in the Frozen Throne, the expansion, are way higher than in the main, like the Reign of Chaos campaigns.
And this was the expansion. Remember, this gutted the melee AI. It fucked up everything in the editor. It turned Black Sphinxes into destroyers. It renamed a bunch of stuff because it was too racist or something.
And you have the idea that the campaigns are shorter, so there's less maps in the Frozen Throne compared to vanilla, and yet you have more Easter eggs. And these Easter eggs are things like hiding a rat named Frank with 100% evasion that you can't kill. Oh yeah, that's a good... Get right on that one. Like, there's like all of these secret Pandaren areas that drop like a ring of protection +1 and laugh at you. It's like, why are those in the game? Like, why would you spend even the little amount of time conceptualizing and developing that particular part of the game and putting effort into that part of the game when your core gameplay... This is a mission where your enemy bases are separated from you by waterfalls. You can't even kill the bases. You can't play the game. And you're putting Easter eggs in the map.
No. Because that's the kind of developers Blizzard are. They don't think they've done anything wrong. They actually think they're doing a good job. They think they're making art. Like, they actually believe this. They actually think that they're doing a good job. They have lived the delusion for so long that they actually start to believe these things that people say. Which is why you ended up with Overweight in Diablo 3. Like, nobody in their right mind thinks that those are good games. But they're super popular because they're good games, right? And everybody is living in this giant circular buyer's remorse of they can't be wrong. And Blizzard realizes, wait, we're popular. That means we're right. That means we're doing a good job. And they just keep shoveling out this garbage over and over and over and over again. By standards that they themselves would never have released a product in 20 years ago. Like, look at what happened with StarCraft 1. It was literally Warcraft in space. It was just Warhammer. And, I mean, it still is Warhammer. But they changed it. People said, hey, this looks just like Warcraft 2. And Blizzard was like, oh, crap. People notice. We gotta do something about this. We gotta change this. Otherwise, people are not really gonna respect our work.
And imagine if
and
people had not given a shit 20 years ago. I mean, this is we're 1 or 2 days after the 20th anniversary of Brood War, or of StarCraft 1 Vanilla. And imagine a world where nobody gave a shit that Blizzard reskinned Warcraft 2 and released it as StarCraft. That would have happened.
We would have accelerated. Yeah.
And we would not have, like, StarCraft 2 would have been, like, so probably worse. I don't know. I'm only speculating.
But it probably would have been happening.
Yeah, there's a...
StarCraft 1 wouldn't have been nearly as successful, so in StarCraft 2 they wouldn't have felt any pressure.
Yeah,
they supposedly felt pressure to make a game as good as StarCraft 1. It didn't show up in development. Well, imagine if they felt no pressure at all. Who knows what would have happened? You probably would have ended up with Diablo 3 too.
Diablo 3 too. Dark Souls 5, 7. So you end up in a situation where if people don't respect your work, it's really hard for you to find... I mean, this is the thing. If you don't respect your work enough to begin with, like, I think that early build of StarCraft, where it was Warcraft 2 reskinned, I don't think that ever should have happened. Like, they should have realized to begin with, we need a new engine, we need to do something different. Maybe you don't need a completely new engine. Maybe you can rebuild it, but you need a new art style. You can't literally have the same UI. You know, you can't just show that stuff. And they should have had their own set of standards.
Blizzard, like, stopped and said, "Oh, you're right. Let's change it."
Absolutely. That's something.
They at least listen to criticism.
They should have learned from that experience, though, and then not made the same mistake in the future. Instead, they somehow regress to the point where, I mean, it's part of a larger cycle, right? It's because...
Well, I think a part of it is also because 3D in general was hit with this huge wave of apologism where people thought it looked good when it didn't. And Warcraft 3 was 3D, so even though Warcraft 3 objectively looked like absolute shit for its age, because it's using like a 1997 era 3D engine, like it's like Bubsy 3D tier, and people were like, "Oh, but it looks good because it's artsy." Literally, the kind of excuses that people did, even though it looked like shit. It looked like shit compared to Brood War. It looked like shit compared to every other 2D engine.
Yeah, well, Exego 2 years later did way better with...
Yeah, Exego just made by like some frigging European developer that was stupid enough to get shacked up with EA and Ubisoft, and...
Yeah, the development team is nothing, and the funding is nothing compared to what Blizzard had for Warcraft 3.
And it was the best-looking 3D RTS that basically had ever been made, and would be made forever.
As far as I have played, for sure, it's the best-looking RTS.
It's using the same kind of color palette as Warcraft 3, but the proportions aren't fucked up, so it's easier to read. The particles aren't as good as Warcraft 3 is, but the texturing and lighting and everything like that are like multitudes better.
Yeah.
And there would never be another game like that. Because they wanted to make StarCraft. They basically, their main inspiration for that game was StarCraft. That's why you had, various StarCraft kind of balancing around it, but it also had a lot of technology in it that Blizzard didn't even attempt to learn from. And the whole thing is really strange to me because Warcraft 3, its prototype was like... It wasn't. I don't think it was really an RTS. It was more like the RPG that they based all the campaign off of.
Right.
And that's basically what became World of Warcraft. They took all those assets. That's what became World of Warcraft. And then somewhere down the line, they just changed Warcraft 3 to be an RTS, which it failed at. They didn't make a good RPG either. And they just became completely scattered when they dropped Condor, Blizzard North, and absorbed that company that they basically StarCraft Ghost was like fishing. They fished for developers who knew 3D just enough that they could slap crap together, and then they shot that company and stole the team members that they wanted. And then you ended up with World of Warcraft and all this other garbage. All the companies and the people that left Blizzard for whatever reason all proceeded to try to make MMOs of their own. Guild Wars, Firefall, Hellgate London, so on and so forth. All of it just... when you are talking of Blizzard and other companies, you really can only make conjecture about why things happen. You can only be like, well, I think this happened because this is what the end result is. You can only make correlations based on things like the public statements, people entering and leaving the company, their fiscal reports. You have the best information you have on hand, which is the end product. The end user should never see a low-quality product. no matter if they're trying to pass it off as art or just a patch or something. There never should be any reason that the end user is saying something that's markedly low quality, much less lower quality than a previously released product at all. That's just their failure as a business. But you've always got to ask, like, what actually is going on behind Blizzard? Because Blizzard has told me, their staff have told me, that the problem is not Activision. That Activision is not an issue. They're not the reason why things are happening. I was never given any more specific information with that, but if you look at historically, Blizzard has horrendous management. They have horrendous management in regards to their tool development, as discussed during Diablo 2 release interview. They have people like Brett Wood, who will publicly tell you that they are aware of all the problems and will never actually fix them because Blizzard quality never existed in their PR or anything like that. Like, you really have got to wonder just how fucked up is this company really is, that this shit happens with, World of Warcraft and all this other crap. Because this shit is like, this is some of the worst shit I've ever seen in games. Being released today in 2018. And yet it's still successful. This is why I discussed in the last podcast, like, the biggest thing that I really could try to get off people is to make them start asking questions. Like, why does this happen? You may never really have a good answer for that, but you have to stop apologizing for everything and saying, oh, it's art, so it has flaws. Like, that's really the excuse where the whole games as art comes from, is people are just swamped in buyer's remorse, then they need an excuse to stop thinking about it.
It's rough because you have a situation where the overall audience of games became more apologetic, became more...
No. Because the people who noticed what was going on, they moved on.
Well, the standards have definitely lowered in many respects. And you'd think the standards for graphics have increased. And certainly the demand for power has increased. And the games now are taking more power to run.
Taking more power to do less is the amazing thing.
But yeah, you have situations where games perform worse while also looking worse than older titles.
It's just like web pages. Like, all these people in their fucking obsession of using Ajax and Flash and HTML5 and all this shit. Technology that in the right circumstances could be useful, but they're using it for some of the most asinine shit. Like, my website is just basically, it uses a CMS, which is really largely unnecessary, but it's using it just for my convenience because I don't fucking know HTML. But you could condense that site down just to like 100 lines or less, and then the CSS on the biggest pages. And fucking sites like Google shit use like 10,000 lines to accomplish what HTML can do in 100. And everything is insanely slow. And then people's excuses is like, oh, well, maybe we should just start making all the processing power get used on the user's computer instead, aka make web pages even more system demanding than they already are, because the servers are having problems keeping up with all the freaking JavaScript and shit they keep tossing onto them. It's the exact same problem with the games. As the barrier of entry gets lowered, people keep looking for more and more excuses to get out of having to actually do things.
It really sucks that the standards of the industry itself have actually lowered, though. That to me is like... That's probably... it's definitely contributed to other developers, not named Blizzard.
Look at Discord. Discord is a heaping pile of shit. It uses an entire fucking operating system for a chat client. It can use well over a gig of RAM. It will flood a Windows Internet Manager process with errors and cause your internet to die. And it can slam your CPU. And the interactions for that are not known, but the bugs have been reported for well over a year. They still come and go. Just yesterday, with an update they had on the PTB client I had to use because the regular client wouldn't even fucking start for me anymore, it's randomly changing the Windows microphone setting. And I checked all the settings. Everything was off in terms of like auto gain and stuff like that. What fucking program walks into your computer and starts changing system level settings? Steam and Discord, both pieces of shit. Pieces of shit not nearly enough people know are just walking around fucking with their settings. Like, if that happened with a recording, it would have destroyed my entire recording just because Discord was on. I wasn't using voice chat. I wasn't connected to voice chat. It was still fucking around with system-level microphone settings anyways.
Reminds me of StarCraft 2.
And then I get an error afterwards that's like, oh, your Discord installation is corrupt. Let's reinstall it. And it tells you to manually go through your applications directory and all this other shit. When the fuck do you have to do that just to uninstall a program? You don't. Because it's done correctly. It has an uninstaller. But this is already too often the case where with garbage companies like NVIDIA, where you have to use frigging third-party applications to properly uninstall their drivers because the kind of people who use that shit just basically don't even pay attention to what the fuck is going on their computer. And then people have all these driver conflicts and garbage like this. I had issues with the AMD drivers where they were leaving stuff behind in the assembly folder on Windows. On the older, I forget what they even called it. It was like 8 or so years ago, but it was still incredibly stupid because I would install new drivers and that would run to very strange problems because there was some information that was not actually getting uninstalled when you were uninstalling the drivers. And nobody holds these people accountable for this shit, so it just keeps going on and on and on. The staffing in the company changes. They may not even be aware that this is happening anymore.
Right, and it's a case of one fuck-up leading to a lot of other people who aren't even informed of the fuck-up will now take the blame for it, will be chastised for it by, other users that come to know it. I mean, this kind of stuff happened all the time with something like League, which was designed, built on top of itself from day one, where in order to even have like a certain ability that had a certain combination of different status effects, they had to rewrite the entire spell engine. And, whatever that part of the engine actually resulted in, I mean, I'm sure there was a bunch of other broken shit. It got to the point where they were laying the groundwork for a champion update, and they broke recall such that after you recalled, you could just right-click out of the shop and you go right back to where you were before you recalled. And they had to turn off ranked for an entire day. So
what I like about League is how they constantly push developer stuff to release. Like where Pantheon, there was like months of Pantheon's alt giving debug messages of different amounts because they don't sanitize their release builds. They have a freaking public testing environment, and then nobody actually looks at their final build and says, did we publish in this build what we were supposed to publish? Nobody does that. Blizzard is like that too. StarCraft 2, Heart of the Swarm, they were fucking with infestors and infestitarians for so long, and the patch notes were always completely different than what actually got pushed. They would note changes that never happened. There was no changes noted. Stuff happened. Like, it was just an absolute disaster. And you really have got to wonder how fucked up, like, this is what I mean, how fucked up where these companies are, where nobody is even attempting to sanitize what is getting pushed to the live environment. Kind of like how you guys posted an image before of Blizzard's site where they were just live testing massive changes to a user interface.
Yeah. Those massive changes included just breaking the website. So
yeah, the whole thing just exploded.
It makes sense. But it may seem like we have gotten off topic here, but I promise you, we are completely on topic. Because these developers tend to be, I mean, these are the guys who are making the games that we're playing. The games that we're talking about, whether or not they are
These guys claim to be making art, and they can't even do the most basic fucking thing correctly.
The issue comes from, again, I want to reference back the idea that, Blizzard changed their tune back during the early days of StarCraft's development, when people held them to a higher standard and said, we don't want a rerun of Warcraft 2. We want a different game. If you're going to give us a science fiction game, you're going to give us another RTS game like we like from you, then don't do what you're doing now. Maybe they didn't outline a complete plan to make what they ended up making, but they at the very least said, this is not acceptable. This is not what we want. And Blizzard's response was not to ignore them, was not to do what... somebody wrote an insanely lengthy essay on Diablo 3's release story, not the Reaper Soul shit or whatever. They went through and said, okay, here we go. We've got this setup here. This is my critique of the story. And they went through like plot point by plot point, had this essay basically that deconstructed everything and talked about how there's just so many different issues with the way that they're presenting the characters, the way that they're presenting the story. And this was he actually was able to talk. The reason why he wrote this essay to begin with is because he had some sort of synopsis of a lot of his points that were in a much more readable format, much shorter. It was like the bullet points or whatever. And he went through and said to one of the lead writers or one of the people involved with the writing team and said, I have these sort of gripes with your story. Would you be interested in some sort of dialogue? Would you have a response to these ideas? Like, just basically try to pick his brains and say, like, because I want to know what happened here, because the original story was a lot different than what you have in Diablo 3 now, and I just want to know where things went differently. And the reaction was, actually, we've gotten mostly positive feedback on the story of our games. So the opposite of responding to critique by taking it under advisement and actually looking at it. And you might not actually...
That's a precise kind of response I've gotten from people. I mentioned this before. I mentioned that, specifically achievements were pointless in all these games because you're not actually achieving anything. And the guy's response was, but the metrics say they're good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like when somebody
sweeping aside
when
everything.
You argue, for example, the idea that a game isn't good and the response of a fan of that game is it sold X copies. It's not really, there's nothing really to do there.
You know, it also sold X copies. Sonic 2006. Are you going to tell me that's a good game? I would like to see someone tell me that's a good game.
Of course, it's my favorite. It's too bad Deadly Premonition.
And if you're not familiar with the game, don't worry, I'm releasing a compilation of it eventually. If you're not, then you should check it out because Sonic 2006, I think, sold about 800,000 copies within a year or less, just in the US alone. It was very, very successful. Incredibly successful game. One of the worst games you're ever going to play if you play it, by far. Even if you make a habit out of playing bad games, it is like World of Warcraft Bubsy 3D tier bad. That doesn't matter. It was still a massively successful game, so that means it was a good game. That's the logic of these people, is that sales means everything, which, I mean, as far as business is concerned, that is true. Sega still sells games. Sega still makes games. They're very comfortable. It was financially successful, but that's why whenever I make these discussions, I always say I'm not talking about the financial success about something. I'm talking about the objective quality of something.
Right, and that helps to get everybody on the same page when it comes to actually looking at the the shared lexicon. When you're talking about, is this game good, and people respond to you with sales figures, then that's when you can just let them know that they're talking about something completely different. And
because I'm never going to argue that these games aren't successful. Like World of Warcraft is an incredibly successful game. It is the most successful game, especially in terms of the development cost and the reward. I doubt you're going to find a more successful game. You would have a hard time convincing me they spent any more than $20 on all the terrain in this game combined, and they sure made a lot more than $20 over their sales figures. I'll be the first one to tell you that this was an enormously successful game. That doesn't mean it was good.
Right, and when you're talking about art, success doesn't actually pertain to whether or not something should be classified as art. There's plenty of starving artists, as the old adage goes, right? The idea that you have a situation where these people are making art, maybe it won't be successful, but if they have passion and they're genuinely trying to design something that's artistic, that is passionate, that has purpose, and they're expressing that purpose, then whether or not it's successful is largely irrelevant to the concept of it being art in the first place. And that is such an important distinction to make, that when you have people who, I'm sort of conflating the argument of whether or not games are art or could be art with the idea that a game X is good. But if you were to ask somebody about whether or not they thought a game was art, largely their reaction is going to be that of you're questioning whether or not a game is good in their head, because they look at it like art is almost like a buzzword now. If a game is art, that means that game is really good. Well, it can be art and shit. The point is that it has to fit the objective qualifications of art. And of course, everybody has to be on the same page as to what art means. And a lot of people aren't like that. A lot of people do look at art in a similar way as I looked at it a year ago, when I was looking at it like, well, everything is art to some degree. It just depends on what that quality of that art is.
Well, you've never been exposed to the idea that things can be bad. You're never going to think things are bad. And you grow up in a situation where everybody succeeds, no matter how much little effort they put in. Then
participation awards and all that.
You're not going to come to those conclusions on your own very easily. So we need is a firm slap with a dick
in the rear.
in the rear. Get those cheeks wiggling.
It just it is a little sad to me to see the change in response from developers like Blizzard, who go from deciding that they want to genuinely design something that at least is more fitting or more representative of some standard of quality than what they were designing with the Warcraft 2 reskin of StarCraft back in the early days. You compare that to their response when somebody has qualms with the story of one of their titles, and they just reply with, "Well, everybody else says it's good, so it's good."
No, in their mind, they can't be wrong. Like, you'll have a hard time convincing an apologist. You'll have an even harder time convincing Blizzard to listen because they have begun to believe their own delusion. Like, when you look at the BlizzCon thing for Overweight from their last stand-up comedy show, they were like, "We would like to be known for Blizzard quality," and it's like,
well, yeah, they consider
you guys haven't had Blizzard quality in 20 years, and you fucking know it. Like, there's no way you can be that delusional, but.
Well, most of the people involved in the company weren't even around 20 years ago in the first place. It's become so bloated, and you have so many cooks in the kitchen that now it's almost impossible for you to have a cohesive vision.
I would love to hear what some of these developers in ArenaNet would say, but you would never find any of them say anything bad about Blizzard, even though they probably hate Blizzard a lot. There's definitely a reason why they left from free money, because they could get sued for it, but I would really love to hear what they actually are thinking about this company and why they left it. If they left it because they think Blizzard, the direction they didn't like where they were going, or something like that, especially when they proceed to make rancid shit like Guild Wars 2. You know, they just basically followed Blizzard's path in the end anyways and just basically commit ritual suicide. But the people who made like Guild Wars 1, I'd really like to hear.
Maybe we can have him on the podcast as a cloaked voice, a dark voice, if you will.
No, a dark voice.
Not to be confused with a voice.
Very racially neutral voice. We're not saying he's black. He's just dark.
Yep. He's I don't know. Didn't they steal a name from one of your books or something? Malash? Wasn't that a name?
Oh, yeah. I'm not so sure about why they do this, but...
Well, they also have...
My name is actually in Diablo 3
as well. That would... How upset were you at that? That must have been a little...
upset, because I know the guy who put it in there, so...
It must have been a little sickening that they had...
It was kind of funny to... Because a lot of people told me about that when Diablo 3 came out, that, oh, your name is in there. How come your name is in there? And it's like, well, I know someone in Blizzard. There's a lot of names in there. There's War Giant, there's Razorclaw X, there's Labyrinth. I think there was one or two more.
I didn't even know Labyrinth was in there. What was he, a tacoman?
Actually, he kind of is. He's in Act 3. He's on the bridge. There's an event for killing him. And he's like a burning, cheesy zombie. So you could say he's got like Chipotle burns or something going on.
It's just Stukov.
So it's kind of entertaining.
Well, that's just another glitch in the Matrix at that point. You get into a situation like just this endlessly referential company. Like just it's references funny. Old community members of games that they don't make anything like anymore. It's depressing. Just reminds you of the time that...
it's really funny because I'm sure like nobody in Blizzard besides a select few people even know who I am, and if people knew who I am,
they wouldn't want you in the... Yeah, they wouldn't want you in the game. Yeah, you'd have to be on watch to see if you got patched out.
But then they would have to re-voice act the lines from Diablo where he mentions me by name.
Oh, shit.
And that is outside of their budget, so they couldn't do that.
Well,
also, I'm pretty sure one of the reasons you did Diablo 3, didn't you? Or at least you did part of it. Did you ever do the Diablo 1 remake where they had an intern very awkwardly voice act the narrative?
I didn't, but I saw the intense mosaic effect that they put over your screen. That's artistic.
So they had an intern revoice everything because I'm pretty sure it's because they actually didn't have license for another product to use the old voices from like 20 years ago. And it got me really thinking about Blizzard because in the past I was like willing to do voice acting for them. and sound editing. And I do it for free. Like, they don't have to mention me by name. Just because their existing staff were so fucking bad and I felt really sorry for them. And it was like, they probably would have taken me up on the offer, but they legally couldn't. And I never really understood how stupid that is until I started, like, in the last couple of years hearing about unions and how stupid unions are.
So Blizzard will only accept voice talent if they are enrolled
they
in
can
the
only
voice
get it from the union.
Yeah,
and they probably don't even have control over who it is. So
I
that's
could not
why World of
imagine.
Warcraft, especially Legion and Warlords of Draenor, it's almost all voiced by a single person.
Yeah.
It's all the same gruff guy who has the exact same sound effects on it on every single thing. And then there's Metzen. And they have like one or two other voices, and some of them are decent. Like Medivh's voice is pretty good. But most of it's just the same fucking guy, and he just sounds bored out of his mind. And then all the demon voices are all absolutely horrendous. And you realize they probably, like, even if they wanted to change that, they probably can't, because they have made some moronic deal with some shit-eating union. And unions are all scum. They're all basically the antithesis of quality, because they're all about getting people who are incompetent into jobs that they otherwise wouldn't qualify for. And Blizzard is probably stuck on some fucking massive contract with them they can never get out of. And that's probably why all their voice acting is so bad.
Now it suddenly makes sense. But what doesn't make sense to me, and what will never make sense, is how they took a talented voice director and a bunch of talented voice actors and still made StarCraft 2.
Yeah, I think it's really like they just have no quality assurance whatsoever. Like,
I still would have thought that the voice director would have been at fault somehow. Like, they must have been. But that voice director did really, really well for some things, like some animated TV shows. Like The Killing Joke, they did that, the voice direction for that.
But the thing is, even people who do jobs really well are only going to do their job really well if they're actually pressured to do so. If the rest of the management sees, oh, this guy has a big name, so he's going to do a good job, but don't actually oversee anything he does, of course he's going to be lazy. He's going to get like six-figure paycheck or more for literally doing fucking nothing. What are you going to do? Put in all this effort for this game you don't even give two shits about and get paid that way? Or just, you know, slack on your job because nobody else even gives a shit and just get paid anyways? Obviously, it's always going to be the latter.
Yeah, but I really don't like to err on the side of assuming that I am better than most people, but I 100% of the time would want to try
I never
and
used to
excel.
be like that, but after it got to the point where I realized even I could do better animations than Blizzard, and I don't even animate, I started like having to accept that there was just a point where it was just too absurd.
Yeah, but
Like,
it
just got to the stage where even I can do better things than Blizzard can, and it's like I've never been trained. I've never managed to teach myself. I have learning disabilities. I'm actually literally autistic, and I can do better graphics than 90% of Blizzard at this stage. I can do better particle effects. I can do better animations. I can do better UV mapping.
Probably in quicker time than what they do.
Yeah, like
judging by the release schedule.
I know I can do better voice acting than most of them. I know I can do better sound editing. Like, at that stage, you just have to kind of accept that because it's, like, inescapable. And it feels kind of sickening to say that, too, because it's like, I'm not professional. I probably wouldn't succeed in an actual corporate environment where people actually, like, had major standards because I don't work well under pressure. But here are people who very clearly have even less experience than I do, who very clearly have never actually given a shit about this stuff and only do it by extent of being rejected out of every other form of business they've ever attempted. And here they are making a game.
AAA should mean something. Awful. And when you and I can make a better game than Blizzard, that's pretty sad.
AAA is just marketing jargon. It's always just been marketing jargon. Americans literally came up with a term to try to goad people into thinking they're a part of something exclusive by spending money on it.
Right.
Like, there is no more American of an approach to a product.
I don't know what a proper word is for it, then. Like...
Garbage.
But the games...
Take your pick.
The games that actual developers with actual funding...
Games.
Yeah. That should mean something,
There's nothing
though.
special about them. They're a product made by somebody who wanted to make a good product, and it's a product, and you spend money on it, and you get a lot of enjoyment about it, and you keep coming back to it, and you know, you experience something that's feature distinct from everything else, and you come out of it, and you don't really have any regrets. Maybe you find a few problems. Not everyone's gonna be perfect, but it was a product. You know, it's like I spent $100 on a fan. I expect that fan to work super well. I expect that fan to run that fan for several years and not have, you know, some kind of major hardware failure. Because I expect all the welds on it to be good. I expect all the bolts to be on good. I expect the oil to be, you know, not leaking, not too much, not too little, etc., etc., etc. I just expect to have something that I paid for. Because the theory is that I've paid product, I've invested in your product, you're competing with other people producing the same kind of product. You're going to want me to spend money on your product because your product is better. Your product is of a higher quality. But what I get is fucking Chinese who have intentionally made it as difficult as possible for me to service this product and has planned obsolescence to force me to buy another one immediately after the warranty goes out. Apple knows all about this because they're getting antitrust lawsuits all over the place in Europe because they keep trying to drop their warranty so they can have stuff fail faster. And their fucking unique screws and all this other shit they hate people developing screwdrivers for. And you go and look at old videos about how to take apart a fan, and you find people taking apart fans that are 30 years old, and they have oil ports on them, and they just oil them up, and they work as good as they knew as they were bought 30 years ago. And the same companies now produce just trash because it's cheaper to just hire random Chinamen and just slap things together and put in obsolescence to get more sales rather than produce a higher quality product, because that's what makes you commercially successful in today's day and age.
So you think probably at this point the main oppositor to any sort of success or any sort of like proper artistic expression for games would be the main opposition to that is just the fact that it's driven by market success as opposed to like,
well, marketing is what gets you your sales. If
like,
you do a good job marketing, you don't have to make a product at all.
I feel like even if marketing was still there, or not marketing, even if the money was still the incentive, if the way to get there was to design a better product, we would be experiencing better products.
If people were like, I won't buy your game because it's not as good as the last game, it doesn't have the same features as the last game, you would see all the developers like Blizzard, EA, you know, Valve, etc. just collapse instantly.
They would have to.
The quality of every product would skyrocket immediately. Even if people's end result is I just want to make money, now the route to making money is I have to make a good product. I have to improve upon old products. I have to learn what other people are doing. I have to make sure it's efficient. I have to make sure it works on hardware just as good as the last stuff. You know, I have to put in effort. That is not an incentive today, so you're not going to see it. And people will never do it because it's more energy, more cost.
We have to wait for people to design. Like, we have to wait for the flash in the pan, fucking once in a blue moon kind of people.
What you need is an industry collapse, similar to the one with that E.T. game or whatever it was, but on a much larger scale. And I think one day we're going to get there, but it's going to probably be like another 20 years.
I thought it was going to happen already. I remember, like, 10 years ago, I was thinking, like, oh, there's no way it can be.
The dynamics are changing a lot, and people are starting to wake up and get melanated, but you're a ways off because you've still got phone games, people paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. You've still got Twitch. You've still got overweight. You've still got people celebrating, you know, loot boxes and all this other shit. You're a long ways off from a collapse at this rate. What you're seeing is basically all the garbage is all getting kind of bundled together. So at least you can make better like decisions with your money in what to avoid.
Well, yeah, there's more red flags or whatever if there's like a bunch of features that you know are fucking the wrong way to go. Like a microtransaction.
There's a one red flag that's always going to be associated with other red flags. So you can make better decisions in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it really just seems to come down to like I was hoping that this log would end, this sort of podcast would end with more of an optimistic tone where we would be like, oh,
I can't be optimistic when it comes to this industry, man.
There's a way for games to become art, and that way is not completely unrealistic. But it does seem like
it's very realistic. I think that Blizzard and other companies are perfectly capable of doing it. They just don't want to.
Right. Well, that's sort of what I mean. Is you're not realistic, as in likely, I guess is a better term for it, right?
Like
it's not likely until
it's not a very difficult concept. You get people who actually want to make a project, and you tell them make what you want to make, and put effort into it, because they're going to put effort into it if they're actually really committed to it. But these kinds of people are also going to be really hard to hire because they know what your company is like and they don't want to have anything to do with it. Like, if Blizzard tried to hire me, I would say, no, not a chance. Because I know how they work. I know what they would want. And what they want doesn't align with...
Right. Yeah, the only way I would work for some company like that is if I had full creative control over a project.
You won't get.
There's never going to be a situation where you have that, especially if you don't have references and past experience and shit like this that people
even if you
had
that, you're still not going to have it.
Because the publishers have their own ideas. They want to be able to market a certain number of things. They want to be able to put off all of these bullet points for the back of the box or whatever. They want to be able to say, like, oh, you got to censor this character model, you got to take out this plot point, this is too racy, this is too dangerous. In this current political climate, actually just never have any guns on screen, please, because that's dangerous.
Yep.
You know,
you can't have switchblades this small because it's illegal.
Yeah. So you get into
situations
where... You
can't have this certain color plate because it's not edgy enough.
Where I know that there's no way that in the modern world... You have to do it grassroots style. You have to make your own shit, basically, like in your spare time, is like almost like what you would do for a hobby, except putting an insane amount of passion into it to the point where it transcends the word hobby. And you would have to do this with either by yourself completely or with a small group of people who are acquaintances or friends of yours whom were also equally as passionate about whatever you guys were making.
When I think of an ideal game developer, I think of Toady One and Dwarf Fortress, because he's basically found the perfect thing. He's doing something that he very clearly enjoys to some extent. He makes quite a good living off of it, and he's constantly improving it, and the end result is good. It is objectively good. It is got a pretty high entry barrier, which is good. So it's not inclined to make it more accessible to people who aren't into that kind of thing, which is precisely what you want out of a game, because it means you can focus on the stuff that actually matters. And
yeah, you're not compromising the product to appeal to an imaginary demographic. I mean, I see a lot of people doing this regardless of the medium we're talking about. A lot of people trying to change their video style or their narrative style or writing style, whatever the case may be, just because, there's... I have these people who already like my content or who would already identify with this kind of content, but what about those people who I don't have yet? I'm going to try and cater to those people. And it's like a classic mistake that you see being made all the time, where if you actually just stuck with what people enjoyed to begin with, and you just tried to improve upon your execution of those concepts and try to improve on those ideas in an organic manner that preserved some element of what was enjoyable to begin with, you wouldn't have these people, these fanboys, these people who were fans of the original game feeling burned because they, now you're trying to appeal to a more casual demographic or a mobile demographic or whatever the case may be. All of these crazy titles that started off as like actual fully fledged games on the PC are now just MOBAs, as you described earlier. Or all of these, I'm pretty sure there's got to be a Final Fantasy one out now at this point.
There's Final Fantasy Online.
Yeah, so you end up in situations where the developers or whoever's working on something, whatever company it is in whatever field it is, are searching for this imaginary demographic that you might be able to take a gamble and grab, but it's a pretty big gamble, and there's, even if you want to look at it from the most greedy sort of profit-driven analysis, you wouldn't do it anyways, because you have what you have right now because of where what your product is in its current state, and you can maximize that and continue pulling in more numbers of that and make that sustainable. If you
That's
just
not
continue
enough
to
for
work
most
on
people, though. They see these big numbers and like, oh shit, you can get so much money on Twitch if you just make sure you never offend anyone ever.
Yeah.
You got to just push that liberal agenda, and you get all these Twitch streamers, and they'll advertise for you. They see the big numbers, they get thirsty. That's basically what it is.
It's depressing.
But that's the industry now. Twitch collapsing will be such a good thing when it happens. There's so many better services out there. There's Hitbox, there's Smash. Twitch is just absolute shit, and the community surrounding it is shit. It's basically just, cam whores and memesters, and that's it. And once that and Reddit is gone, you'll probably see a pretty remarkable increase in quality overall. But the whole industry needs to die, and that's probably like 20, 30 years off, which is unfortunate, but it doesn't mean you can't make a quality product yourself in the meantime.
Right, and that's sort of what we were talking about before I got on a tangent about appealing to a different demographic, and you were talking about the developer of Dwarf Fortress and how his game has a very high barrier of entry, which weeds out all the people who would be only interested if their desires were catered to, as opposed to being interested in it to begin with. And, you know, it's fine. If you're not interested in the title, that's not an attack on your character. It's more so just the idea that, you know, if you're not willing to try...
It's like Cave and Shmups.
Right.
Not many people are going to be into that. But the developer doesn't care, because they're developing for a niche, and they accept that, and they continue to push the bar forward for that niche. So...
yeah, I mean, if you're doing better stuff...
sacrifice all elements of your product.
Yeah, if you're doing more stuff, better stuff, if you're trying to iterate on something and make it better than it was before, and it doesn't really matter how niche that is, you know, there are going to be other people who are interested in it. Even myself, I'm developing these campaigns for StarCraft 1, a game that's been out for 20 years that has no semblance of quality custom content, and basically never has. And you get a situation where there's a couple of outliers that came before me, and now here I am trying to do my best to push the envelope, to have this crazy custom AI that behaves in a way that actually poses a challenge. And there's so many people out there who play other campaigns that just run Zerg campaign difficult and wap de doo la fucking spawn units at you or whatever, and don't actually have any, like, they just break the AI, constantly run the melee script in a campaign environment so it just breaks and does nothing. They wonder what's going on.
Like I said, back in StarCraft 2, nobody in Mapster even knew that you could run custom AI.
Right. And you get, well, that's the thing, is you have a situation where even though it's a very niche market already, it's not being done, and nothing's being done with it. Nobody's pushing any boundaries. No. Nobody's trying to revolutionize anything, even on a small scale, like AI, just one component of it, which is not really small scale, but imagining trying to take one element of an entire production, an entire game, an entire whatever, and deciding, this is what I like this element of it. I want to make this better. And that's sort of what I'm focusing on right now. But overall, level design, trying to make that better. You know, presenting a story with layers and sort of hinting at future events and trying to make it sort of rhyme with itself in a sense, and actually make the characters have impact and be relatable in some degrees and completely unrelatable in other degrees, and shroud some of them in mystery, and do whatever the hell you want to do to make your stories interesting. And yeah, I'm one guy and I voice act almost everything. And yeah, I'm one guy and all of the art is from me. And it was also developed in a stage where I was learning how to even make that kind of art. So you get a situation where you're looking at these custom doodads, and the ones that I developed at the end of the project's lifetime are way better than the ones that I developed at the beginning. And trying to make a consistent quality update or whatever is going to be a really... you know, it's going to be a tough task. But the idea that you have a situation where I'm willing to put in all of this work into stuff, I mean, nobody's really willing to do that in my niche. So yeah. The fact that all of this stuff is super, super difficult, the fact that from the beginning, the first mission will weed out everybody who's even remotely interested in this but doesn't want to actually improve as a player, doesn't want to have to restart the mission a couple of times if they get caught off guard because their fundamentals aren't good enough to carry them through the experience to begin with. I mean, that's good for me. I would rather them not play. And that's why I'm doing stuff like disabling cheat codes, trying to add a timer to save so you can't just save scum your way through it, and which I view as a form of a cheat. Setting all game speeds to the fastest game speed, because slowing the game down might as well be a cheat as well. You know, I'm designing this because I want a hardcore experience that pushes my own limits as a player, and I don't want other people getting some sort of weakened, watered down experience because of whatever they choose to do, because they feel it's too hard. You know, if you want to experience the story, you're going to be challenged just as much as those characters are going to be. And that's like a key part of it as well. I want to inspire people to become better at the game because they find the gameplay engaging and they find the story enjoyable and immersive and whatever the hell else, and they're invested in the characters. They want to see where this goes. And I want to bring all of these sort of marketing buzzwords, if you will, to bear as actual mechanics of the story and gameplay. And it's, you know, it's just like this guy with Dwarf Fortress, where he's taken this very, very niche game, this game that fulfills a single niche, and people are interested in it because he's putting in passion and because he doesn't care to change it. So the people who are dedicated and hardcore enough to play the game despite its high barrier of entry, to learn the game and become better at it, those are the people who he's going to have, like, basically lifelong fans of his game, because he's never going to change from that. He's never going to divert from that course. He's only going to grow within that environment. And I think that's a really important takeaway, where you have a situation where, despite the fact that Dwarf Fortress is an art, despite the fact that I'm not going to be making art with my campaigns, you're still going to have an enjoyable experience. There's going to be some element of a purpose that was carved out before it was expressed. And, you have a situation where there's something there. There's some substance there. Whereas you compare that to the StarCraft 2 default campaigns that came with the game. It's just a world of difference.
I think when you're making a project, your first goal should be make something that you yourself enjoy. And obviously when we were talking about campaigns a couple casts ago with Necron, happy birthday, by the way, and all, we were talking about the difficulty and stuff, and I was talking specifically about my project and how my entire intent was to build something that was going to probably be uncompletable by anybody at Mapster, for sure. Right. I doubt there would be a single person on that website who could finish it. And the whole goal is because there were people who I knew were going to play it. They were going to get StarCraft 2 just to play it, who were good StarCraft 1 players at some point, and people who had put in the time to get into it, and they wanted to get into it specifically because it was difficult. That was specifically why, because the attraction of having that experience was something that they themselves were interested in. That was my audience. That was my niche, and I didn't care if none of them ever actually finished it. That wasn't really my concern. I wanted to have something that I myself could be proud of. And obviously I was never going to even release it. I would make it privately available to those individuals, and that would be it. And my projects weren't always like that. When I started, I was much more interested in becoming popular. I was much more interested in getting people to help. And that ultimately is what led to the destruction of all the projects I worked on, because you're never going to get that. Maybe you'll find some lucky magic formula and you'll somehow become Notch. But very unlikely. I highly doubt that when Notch started, he became as he was then. And he didn't think he was going to become like that. It just happened. So you should set out your goals pretty realistically. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and it's the first thing I recommend to anybody starting voice acting, anybody starting making campaigns. Don't think about making money. Don't think about becoming popular. Just think about improving your skills. See it as a learning experience, and make what you find enjoyable. And maybe it's not going to be that good, but you'll figure out why it's not that good. It took me like 15 years to figure out that I actually really just don't like playing RTSs that much. I don't really like figuring out, all this other shit related to that. I don't like the experiences I'm getting out of this, because for one, it just wasn't possible in the engines I was doing it in. I didn't possess the skills to reverse engineer and all this other shit, so it wasn't going to happen. I was just wasting my time. And I discovered I really didn't like building multiplayer experiences either, because it depended on things I really didn't have. You depend on having that existing player base so that you can build off of it, which I'm doing now. It's really ironic because I am doing that now by building D&D and other stuff. But at the same time, that experience is also completely different. And I discovered, hey, I wanted to make action RPGs like DMC and shit. I want to build something like that that's really good. Now, I'm never going to be able to do that. I can talk about how I would do it, but I know I'll never be able to do it because, I'm not an animator, I'm not an artist, I'm not a programmer, etc., etc., etc. And it was actually something I was going to mention along that vein. It's sort of a segue from this, is that it's not simply that I just don't believe in stuff like art in games. I also don't believe in talent either. I don't believe that people are born with talent. I believe that people have a natural aptitude by things that coexist with the way they think, but they're not born with a natural aptitude for something. There is such a thing as savants, but they're exceedingly rare, and I've never met a single one. I've met people who have picked up 3ds Max and made like top quality CGI within a year. I wouldn't say they had any shred of talent whatsoever. They were just people who are actually committed and dedicated to their task and took the time to work with it. And the end result was they can make quality content within a year. And that's what's really going to separate people from who are actually into making things like campaigns from people who aren't. If you're seeing it as a chore, you're not going to be able to put in the kinds of things to be able to improve as you want. Now, maybe you're going to have a learning difficulty like I do, where you have a really hard time getting any information through. But if you're really dedicated in it, you'll put the time in it, and you'll eventually get it done anyways, which means you have to be prepared to take an extremely long time to do things. You can't set yourself to any kind of schedule. You can't say, I'm going to get X done in Y, because all you're doing is giving yourself more stress and more disappointment. and you won't be able to contend with that. You think you'll be able to, but you won't.
Managing time in projects is a pretty... I mean, that could be its own... Well, managing projects in general, that could be its own topic for an entirely different episode as well. I mean, you consider all of the pitfalls that gigantic developers like Blizzard themselves have with this sort of stuff. You compare that to, well, basically anything else, and yeah, you're going to be in situations where just trying to grapple with all of the different design pitfalls that you could run into, all of the challenges that you already know exist compared to the, forget about the challenges you don't know that you're going to run into partway through. I think back to all of the different weird shit that I encountered while working on these projects that I still encounter now, is like trying to figure out custom tile sets, figuring out how to add these doodads that I've made, and porting existing.
I mean, just working on videos. It's the simplest shit, and I've done it for years. I still run into complications all the fucking time.
Yeah. So there's going to be
consumes a huge amount of my time.
Yeah, and troubleshooting the stuff to find out how to fix it, especially stuff that you didn't expect to need to fix in the first place. That will end up eating up a huge amount of your time. So when you're not doing this as a job, you're doing this as a hobby or as a passion or whatever you want to call it, holding yourself to some sort of schedule seems like one of the most counterintuitive things. I mean, once you have most of everything down pat, you sort of know, okay, when you're starting out, especially, it's a really bad idea to hold yourself to any sort of schedule. But when you're looking
just focus on learning something.
Right. When you have
you
learned the fundamentals, and when you're working on honing your skills, and you want to make something that would basically be a test bed for those skills, and you want to try and express your skills in a creative way by creating a certain project, I mean, maybe then you could start to think about, I want to do X and Y. I want to have the first map out by this month, or whatever the case may be. You can figure out what works for you, but that'll still require some trial and error. And that error part, I don't think you can allow that error part specifically to really fuck with you too much. If you end up having by the end of this month, I was supposed to have something done, but I didn't end up getting it done because of X, Y, and Z. And then you start to try and justify why you didn't make it. And it ends up being this whole weird fucking circle jerk where you have to try and convince yourself that you're not like a shitty human being because you didn't meet a certain goal. And that's where I think a lot of the stress comes from as well, because you think that, this is basic shit, making videos or working on a campaign, or these are things that I could do in my sleep, and yet I'm still fucking them up somehow. I'm finding ways to random complications that will screw me over, and that's why a lot of people would choose to be pleasantly surprised when they manage to make something happen in a timely manner, as opposed to sort of banking on that aspect. And I don't know. There's a certain element of there's a huge element, I would say, of trial and error when it comes to personal projects, passionate projects, things that you have that do have a purpose to be expressed.
See, take videos for example. Beginning of December, last year was shitty. I started good, and then I had a really horrible second half of the summer. So it's like December. That's supposed to be like the time that I'm really productive. And it's like, okay, I'm going to put in the work in December. I'm going to get out at least ICO. And it's like, I start recording and producing ICO, and a guy notices, hey, there's something really strange with the colors in your video. It's like they're getting crushed. And then I have to explain to him about color crushing, and in the process I realized that I fucked up the settings on something, the PS3 or something, and now I'm getting 16 to 235 instead of my actual color range. And actually what happens is this leads me on over a month of encoding and testing and encoding and testing, because encoding for me, to test something on a large scale, because I actually ended up getting suckered into trying to fix encoding settings for Divinity Original Sin 2, because I was getting about 4 gigs to the hour. So I started trying to rescale the video, started trying to figure out how to squeeze what little bit of quality I can out of the video settings and stuff like that. And I spend a day and a half to run one test and code to see if my changes have any effect. So all of December passes just trying to encode videos and figure out what's going on. Ultimately, I discover I can't use Component for the PS3 because I don't actually get the proper color range out of it anyways. So that means I have to get a splitter. So HKS ends up buying me a splitter. I have to wait for that to come. And all of December passes. And then January comes. And I finally am in a stage where I can record Skyrim. I can record Divinity Original Sin 2. I can record anything on the PS3. I've got the colors figured out. I've got the rescaling colored out. I'm ready to go. And then the housing shit starts. And that consumes 2 months. 2 months. Now, remember, my to-do list is huge. I've got stuff from 3-4 years ago I need to do still. I only just finished the compilation for Front Mission Evolved that I recorded in 2011. So my to-do list is massive. I've probably got about 400, 500 hours worth of video that I need to do right now. That's not an exaggeration. So I've got to do all of that. And now I get stuck in the housing situation. And 2 months pass, and only now, the beginning of fucking April, can I be like, hey, I can start working on videos again. Now I'm doing this World of Warcraft thing. I've still probably got about 20 segments to record. It's going to take all month to just record, not even process, just record what I need to do to get somewhere going. But at this stage, you could really get into a mental pitfall of saying, man, I've really wasted so much time. How am I going to tackle all this work? You start getting really stressed out because you're so far behind, but you can't think about that. You go into a one day at a time and you say, I'm going to do one thing today. I'm going to get some recordings I need done. I'm going to start editing one of these projects. I'm going to continue editing a project. I'm going to work on my Harry Potter BDSM album. I'm going to do one thing. Just one thing today. One thing that gets me a little bit closer. And you just take it one day at a time. Take it one step at a time. Because one of the things that people would always tell me when I'm doing my projects is you think too big. You're too ambitious. But the thing is I've done all these small projects already. I've been doing projects for almost 2 decades. I've done everything that's little. I've done the little mini maps. I've done the Dota clones. I've done the reskin this, revoice act that. I'm ready to take on big projects, and I have a strategy for taking on big projects that allows me to do things like a 3-hour-long audiobook in which I cast basically 2 to 3 hours of non-stop takes for one paragraph. So it takes me 2 months to record 3 hours of dialogue and then edit it all. And I'm accustomed to that. I'm accustomed to doing that. And the way you do that is by not worrying about the big step of the project. Because if it's something you want to do, it's something you're going to take the time to do. Which means you're going to accept that some things are not going to get done today. And you're not going to feel bad if nothing happens today because you didn't feel like it. At least you didn't rush it and put yourself further behind and get really pissed off about something. If you don't feel like doing anything, then don't do it today. Do it later.
Yeah, it's better to do it later and do it right than to do a shitty job immediately. And then, like you said, you'll end up wanting to redo that anyways if you actually give a shit. So it'll just be a waste of time. Where you could have actually enjoyed your day relaxing, doing whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely there's lessons to be learned when you actually try to get into content creation and working within this sort of environment where you're trying to make something custom, you're trying to make videos, you're trying to make campaigns or mods or whatever the case may be. And what I've learned is that for sure quality does not come quickly. Even I've worked with custom content in Brood War since I was probably 4 years old is when I started mapping. So obviously not very good, not very wonderful, and certainly not very useful for the long term. So we can say that I've at least had a decade of work within the engine that was useful and foundational in some respect. And I still took way longer to make the very first campaign I've ever released, which was in Consummate. That took me, let's say, that was the only campaign I've ever released. The first campaign I've ever released, and it was 6 maps long compared to all of these like 30 map campaigns with all these filler missions that people made back in the day. And it's but it has all of the features that I've that are now becoming standard in everything else that I do. It has the custom tile sets. It's fully voice acted. It has custom music that I've composed for it. It has actual AI for the enemies. It has entire missions that are tested and variants of which were created before I settled on the exact ones. Basically the same thing as retake, just making a bunch of different takes for the same paragraph of voice acting. It's doing the same thing but for an entire mission design. I'm trying to figure out what are the strongest sort of specimens that you can naturally select the strongest of, and figure out which is going to be the best one, and getting to the point where I finally reached this point where now I've released it. I look back and it had taken me more than half a year of development, of constant development, 2.5 to 3 months of which were nonstop, 8 to 10 hours a day, every single day with no breaks. And that's the position where I was that dedicated to the project, and I was in. I caught got myself into a grind where I was constantly working on it, and I was able to make it work. But it took me over 10 years to release one campaign. Now, obviously, I didn't work on it from the first year, but over 10 years to get me to a position where I could even start working on the first campaign that I would eventually release. And if it takes you 10 years, then you're going to obviously think, this better be worth the 10 years that I spent. And that's that's a really bad mental pitfall to run into.
Yeah, that's where I was with my one novel, Throne of Armageddon. I worked on that for 10 years, and in 2009, the end of 2009, I was actually rewriting the whole thing. I was 200 pages into rewriting. I was doing about 30 pages a day of like high quality polished writing I couldn't do today now. And then 2010 started, and there were so many times where I'd get into like really bad bouts of like a lot of time would go by. Ooh, that hurts. And I would not write for an extremely long time. And this was bad. This was super, super bad. So 2010 starts. I get like bronchitis or something, and I stop writing. And then I never wrote again. And I actually attempted suicide over that, because it was like, well, however many months pass, I'm not done anything. I'm never going to be able to finish this. I've actually committed. It's like the sum of my life's work. All my mods and everything are all based on this. And now, it's 10 years down the line and I've gotten nowhere. So, yeah, I overdosed on a bunch of some pills that apparently would give you a heart attack, but they never gave me a heart attack. And that's when my doctor, who was supposed to be helping me with mental health care, decided just to move his practice. So that didn't help either. So yeah, it was bad. And after that, I had decided, you know what? I'm never going to write again. I'm never going to get involved in this again, because it had destroyed my experience with the very process of being creative. The whole experience had salted basically everything. And I had that exact same experience with StarCraft 2 and Sins of a Solar Empire, where I had, invested a year and a half into building Retribution, the thing I eventually turned into the audiobook. And that time was a huge waste as well. Oh, I just got ass plowed. I'm sitting here wondering why this guy is not fucking healing us, because we're killing this dude, and he's this druid. You fucking heal, and we're killing this rare, and like, you want to kill it, and we're dying to incidental damage. So why don't you heal us? So he just fucking stands there and aggro some other trash that just run over and just pounds us in the asshole.
Sounds like a stand-up individual.
So yeah, StarCraft 2 and Sins of a Solar Empire, Retribution. I want to make a movie. At that stage, I had made Salvation, which was a disaster, and I considered that a horrible failure. And I was like, I realize this is a mistake. I want to make something better, so I'm gonna make something better. And I made it because some other guy is like, hey, I will help you with character models. And I'm like, okay. So I start rebuilding it. It takes me a year and a half. And I'm in the phase of learning everything, of improving, of being like, hey, I'm going to take all these assets I made for the original project, which was close to 2 years of work. I'm going to redo all of it. And I end up redoing it about 3-fold. I redo all the particles. I was at revision 13, which means I had redone the particles 13 times, because every single time I made an improvement and I learned something new or I made new assets, like new, because I was making all the textures and stuff by hand with Fume FX. I want to make sure everything looks good. So I go through everything all over again and improve them all in the same way. And I had this hammered down to a very methodical process. I was basically done the Sins of a Solar Empire portion. All I needed was the character assets. And then this guy's like, oh, I don't feel like doing anything. A year and a half of my work later. It wasn't some random person either. It was someone I had known for, at that point, about like 10 years or longer. And I had no reason to believe that he was deceiving me, but he was. So what happens is I now have a year and a half of labor I've put into Sins. I put into Unreal 3. I made all these scenes. I made all these ships. I made all these textures. I made all these sounds, all this other stuff. That stuff is actually all now useless. It just gets thrown out because there's nothing else I can use it for. So that also really hurt my passion for creating custom content. And then there was StarCraft 2. You know, from the very first week in beta, all the way to 2016, I had been working quietly on StarCraft 2, learning the ins and outs, making graphics. That's why I was picked up for StarCrafts and for Pirates, Dwarven Combat, and stuff like that, is because I knew all this shit nobody else knew. I trained people as well. And my own project, however, I'm stuck behind the computer AI. And it takes us 6 fucking years to get to the stage where we have something that's functionally good. Not perfect, but good. But the performance is still absolutely atrocious. So it's basically I can't even play my own fucking maps. And even on the computer that with a current generation processor, it still is really, really bad performance because that's just how slow Galaxy and Blizzard's engine is. So I basically had to walk away from 6 years of preparation work, getting everything figured out, figuring out the ins and outs of the graphics, of porting all the assets, of making my own stuff, of learning how to UV map, of learning how to kit bash, learning how to do all the sounds and stuff, starting to learn data editing, working out the ins and outs of terrain and stuff like that, all the stuff I've shown you. I have to throw all that away and say, I can't do this. That's the end of 6 years of labor. So the only way I could really rationalize with that was that, you know, oh my fucking God. I'm trying to, like, I'm basically, what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to get stuff set up for recording World of Warcraft, and I'm trying to navigate through this Argus area they've added, and it is cancer. It is some of those badly designed, frustrating shit in this game, where you go anywhere near lava, you just suddenly take 800,000 damage and instantly die. Like, fucking what? So, the way I rationalize with all this time that I've spent is obviously, you know, at the end of the day, what I want is, I want not necessarily popularity or success. What I want is something I myself can be proud of. And here I've spent, you know, an enormous amount of work that if I had the skills, I could have made my own game from scratch and had it completed by this stage. But I don't have those skills, and I have to accept I'm probably not going to have those skills. Fucking what?
Uh-oh. We have a technical error.
I am mildly Jimmy jostled at this stage. So, basically, the way I see it is, okay, so I've gone through StarCraft 2, Sins of the Solar Empire. I've wasted actually a total of about 8 years now trying to make a project, and I've not made a project. I sat down Armageddon Onslaught in 2009. That was my last Brood War project. I put tons of time into that, and at the end of the day, I had to release something that I had a crash in it I knew I couldn't fix. It had stuff in it I couldn't finish. And it was really, at the end of the day, just like basically a tech demo. So I had spent, from before then till now, basically accomplishing utterly... Right now, I am dying immediately after I'm respawning, and I don't even know why. There is nothing telling me, oh, you're going to die if you go here. You just get hit with damage and you're dead. So the way I rationalize with this is I say, well, I've picked up all these skills. So I've learned how to make particle effects. I've learned how to remaster stuff. I'm better at porting stuff than I used to be. I could basically walk into almost any game right now and say, I can do graphics for that. Whereas 10 years ago, I didn't know shit. All I knew is how to port some stuff from Warcraft 3. from World of Warcraft to Warcraft 3 and patched that up a little bit, and not nearly as fast as I can do so now. So now I could walk into Unreal and say, hey, I'm a technical artist. I can make a scene in Unreal 4. I can do lighting. I can do professional grade particle effects. I know how to make my own textures for particle effects. I know how to use Fume effects. I know how to deal with the pipeline for putting assets into here. If there was ever a situation where I can make use of this, then I have the skills necessary to do so. You know, I could walk into almost any commercial level thing right now. I literally could make StarCraft 4 Void of the Abyss, of the Chaos Spell Void. I know everything I would need to know to actually make another installation of StarCraft right now. I can make all the graphics, I can make all the sounds, I can make the campaign, I can do pretty much anything. In itself, it's useless, but the skills did get me closer to being able to make what I one day wish I could make, which is a Devil May Cry in Unreal 4. I know how to make all the particle effects. If I had the Dante assets and the animations and stuff set out, I could be like, hey, here's your particle effects. Here's your levels, here's your lighting, here's your collision. I know how to do all that. So I try to not think of it as I fucking failed for 10 years trying to make stuff and got absolutely nowhere. It sucks. It's bitter. It's horrible to go through all that work and just have to throw it out, and you don't want to deal with it anymore. It killed my passion for modding. I'll probably never mod ever again. But I look at it as being, it was a learning experience, and I still came out of it with more than what I entered it with.
Yeah, and that's basically all you can. I mean, that's always going to be a constant when you're working with custom content. When you're looking at something like, I don't know, when you're working on something that's related to modding, or you know, you're making your own shit on the side, not in a professional setting, more in a personal passion / hobby / whatever you want to call it. You have a situation where you have these skills that you're going to need to start learning if you're going to be successful. And I guess to wrap this kind of conversation up, you look at the topic of this episode is games as art, and one of the things that you mentioned was that Brood War, the multiplayer at the high level, was a medium that could be used as artistic expression. And I feel like it's almost a similar kind of argument that you can make, where working on a product that may never become art, may not be able to be classified as art, the learning to work on that product itself is a form of, like, I don't know if it's artistic expression exactly, but there's some purpose there that you are expressing.
It's not an artistic expression, but it's an expression in which you'll find meaning, because chances are the reasons why you're behind something, trying to make something, is because you want to do something. There's some part of you that says, I want to build something that is my own. Maybe it's just for yourself. Maybe it's because you want to make something for your friends, but there's something that's driving your desire to step into the foot of something that's otherwise unfamiliar and put in your time and your energy to build something that you yourself created. And that in itself can be a very, very fulfilling experience. For me, I don't find the process of building stuff enjoyable. I hate it. But I like seeing the stuff I've made in motion. Right now, I build D&D maps, and I build them in Unreal 4. I go through the process of taking assets out of games or modeling them myself. I make materials for them that translate all this color information, all the normal map information, turns it to masks, makes, you know, new textures, higher resolution textures and stuff out of all that old information. And all this stuff is all from all kinds of different things, unrelated things that I all pulled all together for this one purpose. And that can be very frustrating and very time consuming. I have to deal with an orthographic camera. I have to use baked lighting. There's tons of bugs all over the place. It can be very time consuming to try to fix that. But then you actually get into the game and you're actually playing it, and you don't worry about that anymore. Because now you have the end product that you're playing with like 4 other people, and you're no longer stuck in that development hell, and you are experiencing something that you yourself put together, and it's an experience that nobody else has seen. Nobody else has played, especially in this medium. Most people in D&D are using stuff that was photoshopped together out of some brushes, stuff that just doesn't really look that good or that consistent, or stuff that you have to fucking pay money. You have to pay money for a still image. It's absurd. And, you know, none of these people will have seen the kind of environments I'm creating. They certainly won't have seen the actual maps that I'm creating. And I set that standard for that quality, and that's why people play this game. Because they know that's what to expect out of my delivery, is having that experience. And delivering that experience and having everything put together, that's what keeps me going, is that end result. And, you know, that in itself, that's the passion, is to bring that delivery, because I want to give people an experience. My end result is I want to give people an experience. I want to introduce them to a world they've never seen before. I want to introduce them to maps and assets and stuff they've never seen before. I go through most of my time that I'm not spent working on videos, I'm looking for music and stuff to put into this D&D campaign. So it's all the same process as anybody making a campaign for StarCraft. You're looking for that perfect music, you're putting together your perfect maps, your perfect dialogue and stuff like that. I'm doing all that for a D&D in a platform that will never be publicly visible except in some developer commentary videos I release. The vast majority of people will never even know that this is what I'm doing with my time. People think I'm still making mods or something because they haven't talked to me for forever. And it's like, no, I haven't done mods since StarCraft 2. And I never will. I'm building something for 4 people, and those are the reactions I'm looking for. It's just those 4 people. But it's content that if I had wanted to, I could sell. You know, I could sell this stuff. I could probably sell it at $40, $50 a pop for a map, because those are kind of the prices I've seen now. And I would probably get sales. If that's what I really, really wanted to do, I could probably try to sell this shit. And I don't give 2 fucks about that, because that's not why I'm making it. Does that make it higher quality than normal? No. It just means my value is in an experience. And that means I'm going to keep doing it, you know, even when things are slow and tough, regardless, because it's just something I want to do. Once you find something that is your passion, and you may get into custom content campaigns and stuff, and it's going to feel like a real goddamn chore, and you're not really going to get that much out of it, and then you're probably not going to pursue it. That's 90% of people who get into campaigns. That's everybody at Campaign Creations. The only person at that site who even still has anything to do with these games is RazorClaw X. He still releases Warcraft 3 campaigns. Are they good? I don't know. I haven't played them. But whatever it is, he finds some kind of substance in it, and he keeps going in it. He doesn't get compensated for it. He's not particularly famous, but he finds some return from it. Which means I would be much more inclined to play something he has created over something that is on Steam right now in the top sellers because someone advertised it on Twitch.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is a situation where if you have somebody who's actually still working on these games many, many years after they began, those are the rare few who stick around. Not the opposite of the flash in the pan stuff that I was describing earlier. And, you know, sometimes you have situations where you need those people who, I mean, we all started as potential 90%ers who started off looking at stuff that was a chore and opting to not do that stuff, instead doing the stuff that was more exciting. And, you know, when I first started working on AI, I didn't think it was particularly thrilling. I thought, oh, this is kind of a brave new world, but, you know, after a while, I'm just going to move on. Most likely, I'm going to be like, all right, this is some chore I've got to do. When I first started making this custom terrain, that was kind of neat, but soon became something that was very time-consuming. And the same is true, I'm sure, of things that, you know, when you're verifying your videos, or, you know, you have your own process for encoding and all of this stuff that takes forever. And it's not going to be something that most people will be enjoying.
I mean, most people would have probably given up when they had the syncing issues I had. When I first started doing console recordings, Viking Battle for Asgard, Killzone 3, Danny's Inferno, every single one of those runs, the audio was fucked. I could not get anything to give me synced audio because the thing I was using to capture the video from the capture card, Blackmagic Media Express, they wouldn't capture my audio. So I tried Audition. It would desync it. That's what desynced everything. I tried Vegas. It would desync it. I tried other versions of Audition to desync it. Audacity wouldn't even record separate things. Like I was stuck with 3 games, 3 very annoying games to get through. All their audio was host. I scrapped 2 of them. I manually resynced Viking Battle for Asgard. That means every minute of that game's audio, I had to step in and manually resynchronize it to be as close to the visuals as possible. Most people would not do that. And I'm not even a person who gives a shit about subscriptions. I don't give a shit about ad revenue. I distanced myself from YouTube and everything related the moment that stuff started becoming normal. Most of the stuff you'll never find anywhere. I had maybe 24 viewers at that stage that were actually watching the LPs, and I didn't care. I went through the effort of trying to fix all this shit out because at the end of the day, you know, I spend probably about 5 or 6 times as much dealing with the videos of a recording as I actually do making the recording. Divinity. 26 hours in code time per segment of 3 or so hours. Takes me about 2 or 3 days man hours to actually edit the segments. Vegas is a piece of shit. It's constantly crashing, being slow, but it's the only video editor that's any good in terms of user experience. And I do it all for that end experience. It's all for, you know, at the end of the day, I'll release something that is a fully completed run. I release it in high quality. And you don't have to go through streaming and buffering and shredding your hard disk and all this other garbage to get it. And I don't get a lot of feedback, but I don't do it for the feedback. I do it because I know that some people are watching it, and those people have always been watching it. And that's enough for me. And most people who have tried to get into videos, I've tutored a lot of people to get into videos, they can't do that. They just want that instant return of having, you know, 10, 20, 30,000 subs, you know, their name plastered all over Google search results and everything. And they realize that, oh, there's going to be effort to get in this. Like Laconius. I told you about Laconius.
Yeah.
He was like, he wanted money. So Wybod was going to help them set up a YouTube channel, and they're going to do game reviews. And he didn't want to put in even the slightest bit of effort to learn anything. And it eventually resulted in him voiding all of us.
Void.
And getting deported back to Korea. Because he didn't want to put in the effort to even learn how to use OBS. Like the most easiest to use of all video software. It takes all the complications of dealing with final encodes out of the business. Or whatever. He wanted Wybod to do all the work. And Wybod's like learning how to be a surgeon and everything. Like he doesn't have that much time. And that's what most people didn't want to. They would say, hey, I'm interested in making videos, but it's like it's something that like catches their momentary flight of fancy. But it's a commitment. All of this shit is a commitment. It's a time commitment that's going to far outscale your flight of fancy. If you want to get into game design or making a campaign or something just because it looks kind of neat, don't do it. Save yourself the trouble and don't even start. Because you're going to just get yourself pissed off. And you're going to accomplish nothing.
Well, that's sort of what separates, things that could be meaningful expressions from that momentary flash in the pan shit. You get into situations like, oh, I don't know. I guess we're sort of just retreading the old ideas, but I think the core concept remains the same. Games may not be art, but the high level, mechanically and strategically demanding games like StarCraft, and I guess like the original Quake games and stuff like that, they will offer avenues of expression that are very alike, very akin to art in the end result. And the very act of creating something custom within a game engine, you may not be creating art, but you're certainly doing something meaningful with your time. If you're truly passionate about it and you're willing to put in the grind and put in the work necessary to make something high quality out of your personal passion, something that you can be proud of. It's pretty important.
Don't take these words as a way of saying, oh, creating games is some super abstract, arcane science that only a few people can understand. It's actually very easy to get into. It's super easy. It's never been easier. The bar has never been lower. You could start today, and in a month, you could have a functional prototype in Unreal with your own custom sounds and graphics. It's not actually that difficult, but you do need to be prepared to commit to it, and the commitment is really the big thing.
Yeah, you need to be willing to put in the grind to actually get stuff done, to learn new skills that you probably never thought you were going to have to learn to do something like make a game. And when you come out of the end of that tunnel, you know, when you're done working on it, either because you abandoned the project or because you released the project, you will be a very different human being. You'll have very different skills. You'll have evolved in some way that, again, you probably didn't think you would, given the circumstances. So I would say go for it. I mean, if that's something you're interested in, but you have to be prepared to either see yourself out early enough that you don't sink too much time in it if you find out it's really not for you, if your heart's really not in it. Or dig yourself in deep and buckle the fuck up, because it's going to take a long time. Despite it being easy to get into. If you want to do it right, then you're going to have to redo a lot of work. You're going to have to do work just to get experience so that you know how to do it right, and then do it right again, and then do the same thing, but again, over again. Because
I know a guy who he wants to do the same thing I want to do. He wants to make Devil May Cry, because there is no good action RPGs out there. So he says, well, I may as well do it myself. So how do I get started? And says, okay, well, pick up Unreal 4. You're going to need to learn how to make your own graphics and go from there. So he gets Unreal 4. In about a week and a half, he has AI that can jump up ledges and stuff. Just he never has done this stuff before. The most he's done is StarCraft stuff. He's made custom StarCraft sprites and stuff. But now he's jumping into the wonderful world of programming. So now he's got an AI that can navigate Z very basically. So that's already an improvement beyond games like God of War. But now he's like, okay, well, if I want to get further, I have to make my own assets. So now I got to get in graphics. So he says, I'm going to model a cat. I'm going to sculpt a cat. So in a day, he has a cat model. It looks like a cat. The tail looks kind of like a sausage, but it looks like a cat. But now it's like, okay, so next step is now to learn about edge flow. So I tell him, what you want to do, you want to first learn the pipeline and everything involved, so you know actually what you need to get done to have something within Unreal 4 you can deal with. You want to have everything kind of at like a personal level, so you understand every step of the journey. Don't focus too much on one thing. Don't burn yourself out. Focus on all the little steps to get something ready. So one thing I always like to do whenever I started like experimenting with a game is I would try to get a custom graphic into it and make a custom unit. So that would get me in the concept of how do I take what I know how to do, which is get models into 3ds Max, and put those in the game and deal with how the game deals with those and make that actually functional. So I tell him, just now you worry about edge flow. Edge flow is a really big subject. It's super, super complicated to first get into, but you got to get into it now so that you understand the process of how your mesh that you've just learned how to slap together really quickly is interacted with when you've got your rig and your skeleton. In Blizzard land, they don't even know what edge flow even is. That's why arms and stuff just fold into each other like clipboards whenever anything animates, because their topology is a disaster. You don't want to be like Blizzard. Look at Blizzard and see that as a fantastic example of what not to do. So, you know, you learn how to do basic edge flow so your limbs don't turn into pancakes. And then you learn how to weight bones. And then you learn how to do basic animations. And I learned basic animations by basically... People asked me, hey, can you animate? And I said, no. We needed an animation. And I'm like, what kind of animation? And they're like, we need a kneeling animation. And I'm like, well, I can try. Thankfully, it was for the Dark Templar, which existed in StarCraft 2 as sample assets, which meant it already had a rig I could interact with. So I just walk into 3ds Max. I've never fucking done this before. Never done it with an organic model. And I understand that animations work by keyframes, and I just move stuff around until it looks vaguely like he is kneeling. And they were so happy. So happy with it. And I'm like, this looks like shit. But it was my very first animation. And I showed it to Labyrinth, and he says, yep, that looks like a Blizzard animation. And at that stage, I knew I was ready for the AAA industry.
So what you're saying is, first time is the only time you can actually make AAA industry graphics.
Yeah. The second you start actually asking questions, you're not allowed in the industry anymore. Questions cost time and money.
Mm-hmm.
So the moral of the story is, don't be afraid to do a sloppy job. Just know that somewhere along the lines, you're going to want to improve it. Accept that and move on. Take from everything at a superficial value the lessons that would have offered with you. I learned, hey, making an organic animation once you have a rig is actually not really that difficult. Setting up your rig is the most important part of getting your animations ready. If you have a bad rig, you can't make a good animation. You can make a bad animation out of a good rig, but it's much easier to make a bad animation out of a bad rig. So don't be afraid to like take your time to ramp that up. And I have to depart because I actually really need to take a shit.
Hey, me
And
too. This is a good time for everybody.
I could tap into here on my tablet and let you guys listen, but I'm probably going to actually save that for my next musical production.
Perfect. So do you have any final words to say besides wishing Necron a happy April Fool's birthday?
Happy birthday, Necron. It's not April's Fool's, it's Necron's birthday, duh. Art is something you should never even be worried about when making a game. Don't even think about, am I making art, because it is such an irrelevant buzzword at this stage that you'll never have to concern yourself about at any stretch of the imagination. Don't worry about making a statement. Don't worry about pushing an agenda. Just make something you find fun to enjoy and polish it up to the point that you yourself can respect it. And then next time, challenge yourself to improve that project. Challenge yourself to make something that's an improvement upon what you originally created. And over time, you'll find yourself improving as well, even if you struggled to initially.
I agree. Let's take a shit.
Let's take a shit! Let's hold hands and squeeze our butts to the window where the jars are and fill her up.
Thanks, IskatuMesk.